Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man! Statement, the First Secretary of State and Chancellor of the Exchequer, Chancellor Philip Hammond.
Mr. Speaker, it's a privilege to report today on an economy which the IMF predicts will be the fastest growing major advanced economy in the world this year. An economy with employment at a record high and unemployment at an 11-year low. An economy which, through the hard work of the British people, has bounced back from the depths of Labour's recession. And an economy which has confounded commentators at home and abroad with its strength and its resilience since the British people decided exactly 5 months ago today to leave the European Union and chart a new future for our country. Mr. Speaker, that decision will change the course of Britain's history. It has thrown into sharp relief the fundamental strengths of the British economy that will ensure our future success. The global reach of our services industries, the strength of our science and high-tech manufacturing base, and the cutting-edge British businesses that are leading the world in disruptive technologies. But it's a decision that also makes more urgent than ever the need to tackle our economy's long-term weaknesses, like the productivity gap, the housing challenge, and the damaging imbalance in economic growth and prosperity across our country. Mr. Speaker, we resolve today to confront those challenges head-on, to prepare our country to seize the opportunities ahead, and in doing so, to build an economy that works for everyone, and an economy where every corner of this United Kingdom is part of our national success. Mr. Speaker, I want to pay tribute to my predecessor, my right honourable friend, the member for Tatton. My style, Mr. Speaker, will of course be different from his. I suspect that I will prove no more adept at pulling rabbits from hats than my successor as Foreign Secretary has been at retrieving balls from the back of scrums. But my focus on building Britain's long-term future will be the same. He took over an economy on the brink of collapse, with the highest budget deficit in our post-war history, and brought it down by 2/3. That is a record of which he can be proud. But times have moved on, and our task now is to prepare our economy to be resilient as we exit the EU and match fit for the transition that will follow. So we will maintain our commitment to fiscal discipline while recognising the need for investment to drive productivity and fiscal headroom to support the economy through the transition. Mr. Speaker, let me turn now to the forecasts. Since 2010, the Office for Budget Responsibility has provided an independent economic and fiscal forecast to which the government must respond. Gone are the days when the Chancellor could mark his own homework. And I thank Robert Choate and his team for their hard work. Today's OBR forecast is for growth to be 2.1% in 2016, higher than forecast in March. In 2017, the OBR forecasts growth to slow to 1.4%, which they attribute to lower investment and weaker consumer demand, driven respectively by greater uncertainty and by higher inflation resulting from sterling depreciation. That is slower, of course, than we would wish, but still equivalent to the IMF's forecast for Germany and higher than the forecast for growth in many of our European neighbours, including France and Italy, a fact that will, no doubt, be a source of very considerable irritation to some. As the effects of uncertainty diminish, the OBR forecasts growth recovering to 1.7% in 2018, 2.1% in 2019 and 2020, and 2% in 2021. While the OBR is clear that it cannot predict the deal the UK will strike with the EU, its current view is that the referendum decision means that potential growth over the forecast period is likely to be 2.4 percentage points lower than would otherwise have been the case. The OBR acknowledges that there is a higher degree of uncertainty around these figures than usual. Despite slower growth, the UK labour market is forecast to remain robust. We have delivered over 2.7 million new jobs since 2010, and this forecast, Mr. Speaker, shows that number growing in every year. Another 500,000 jobs created over the OBR forecast, providing security for working people across the length and breadth of Britain. Mr. Speaker, for those who claim that the recovery is just a southeast phenomenon, I have some news. Over the past year, employment grew fastest in the northeast, the claimant count fell fastest in Northern Ireland, pay grew most strongly in the West Midlands, and every UK nation and region saw a record number of people in work. That, Mr. Speaker, is a labour market recovery that is working for everyone. Monetary policy has played an important role in supporting growth since the referendum decision, but a credible fiscal policy remains essential for maintaining market confidence and restoring the economy to long-term health. In view of the uncertainty facing the economy and in the face of slower growth forecasts, we no longer seek to deliver a surplus in 2019-20. But the Prime Minister and I, Mr. Speaker, remain firmly committed to seeing the public finances return to balance as soon as practicable, while leaving enough flexibility to support the economy in the near term. Today, I am publishing a new draft charter for budget responsibility with 3 fiscal rules. First, the public finances should be returned to balance as early as possible in the next Parliament, and in the interim, Mr. Speaker, cyclically adjusted borrowing should be below 2% by the end of this Parliament. Second, that public sector net debt as a share of GDP must be falling by the end of this Parliament. And third, that welfare spending must be within a cap set by the government and monitored by the OBR. In the absence of an effective framework, the welfare bill in our country spiralled out of control, with spending on working age benefits trebling in real terms between 1980 and 2010. As a result of the action that we've taken since 2010, that spending has now stabilised, and the cap I'm announcing today takes into account the policy changes made since the last budget, setting a realistic baseline reflecting all announced welfare policies, and I confirm again today that the government has no plans to introduce further welfare savings measures in this Parliament beyond those already announced. I now turn, Mr. Speaker, to the OBR's fiscal forecasts, but first I will set out the key drivers of changes since the budget. The post-budget changes that were made to welfare and housing policies cost the Exchequer £8.6 billion over the forecast period. Expected ONS classification changes have added £12 billion since budget. And tax receipts have been lower than expected this year, causing the OBR to revise down projected revenues in future. Added to this is a structural effect of rapidly rising incorporation and self-employment, which further erodes revenues. Combining these pressures with the impact of forecast weaker growth and taking account of the measures I shall announce today, the OBR now forecasts that in cash terms, borrowing is set to be £68.2 billion this year, falling to £59 billion next year, £46.5 billion in 18-19, then £21.9 billion, £20.7 billion, and finally £17.2 billion in 21-22. Overall, public sector net borrowing as a percentage of GDP will fall from 4% last year to 3.5% this year and will continue to fall over the Parliament, reaching 0.7% in 21-22. This will be, Mr. Speaker, the lowest deficit as a share of GDP in 2 decades. The OBR expects cyclically adjusted public sector net borrowing to be 0.8% of GDP in 2020-21, comfortably meeting our target to reduce it to less than 2%, and importantly, leaving significant flexibility to respond to any headwinds the economy may encounter. The OBR's forecast of higher borrowing and slower asset sales, together with the temporary effect of the Bank of England's action to stimulate growth, translates into an increased forecast for debt in the near term. The OBR forecasts that debt will rise from 84.2% of GDP last year to 87.3% this year, peaking at 90.2% in 2017-18 as the Bank of England's monetary policy interventions approach their full effect. In 2018-19, debt is projected to fall to 89.7% of national income, the first fall in the national debt as a share of GDP since 2001-2, and it is forecast to continue falling thereafter. Members of the House may be interested to know that stripping out the effects of the Bank of England interventions, underlying debt peaks this year at 82.4% of GDP and falls thereafter to 77.7% by 21-22. Mr. Speaker, it is customary in the run-up to the autumn statement to hear representations from the Shadow Chancellor of the day, usually for untenable levels of spending and borrowing. We used to think on this side of the House that Ed Ball's demands were an extreme example, but I have to say the current Shadow Chancellor has outperformed him in the fiscal incontinence sweepstake, Mr. Speaker. What we don't know, of course, is whether he can also dance. I have received some... He can. Good. Good. A second career awaits him, Mr. Speaker. I have received, Mr. Speaker, some more measured representations from a range of external bodies, some of them calling for fiscal expansion, while others have suggested that there is no need at all to respond to a changed economic outlook. And that reflects, to be fair, the challenge that we face of resolving how best to protect the recovery, build on the economy's manifest strengths, yet at the same time respond appropriately to the warnings of a more difficult period ahead. But with our debt forecast to peak at over 90% next year and a deficit this year of 3.5%, I have reached my own judgment. It is a judgment based on a sober analysis of our fiscal position, but also a realistic appraisal of the weakness of UK productivity and the urgent need to address our fiscal challenge from both ends, continuing to control public expenditure, but also growing the potential of the economy and protecting the tax base. So we choose, in this autumn statement, to prioritise additional high-value investment, specifically in infrastructure and innovation, that will directly contribute to raising Britain's productivity. And the key judgment we make today, Mr. Speaker, is that our hard-won credibility on public spending means that we can fund this commitment in the short term from additional borrowing, while funding all other new policies announced in this autumn statement through additional tax and spending measures. That is the responsible way to secure our economy for the long term. Mr. Speaker, the productivity gap is well known to honourable and right honourable members, but shocking nonetheless. It bears repeating. We lag the US and Germany by some 30 percentage points in productivity, but we also lag France by over 20 points and Italy by 8 points, which means in the real world it takes a German worker 4 days to produce what we make in 5. And that means, in turn, that too many British workers work longer hours for lower pay than their counterparts. And that has to change if we are to build an economy that works for everyone. So raising productivity, Mr. Speaker, is essential for the high-wage, high-skill economy that will deliver higher living standards for working people across this country. As a result of decisions taken by my predecessor, public investment is higher over this decade than it was over the whole of the period of the last Labour government. But today I can go further. I can announce that we are forming a new National Productivity Investment Fund of £23 billion to be spent on innovation and infrastructure over the next 5 years, investing today for the economy of the future. Let me set out, Mr. Speaker, for the House how this money will be used. Mr. Speaker, we do not invest enough in research, development and innovation. As the pace of technology advances and competition from the rest of the world increases, we must build on our strengths in science and tech innovation to ensure that the next generation of discoveries is not only made here, but is also developed and produced in Britain. So today I can confirm the additional investment in R&D rising to an extra £2 billion per year by 2021, announced by my right honourable friend the Prime Minister on Monday. Mr. Speaker, economically productive infrastructure directly benefits businesses, but families too rely on roads, rail, telecoms and especially housing. We've made good progress, with the number of new homes being built last year hitting an 8-year high. But for too many, the goal of home ownership remains out of reach. In October, my right honourable friend, the Communities Secretary, launched the £3 billion Home Builders Fund to unlock over 200,000 homes and up to £2 billion to accelerate construction on public sector land. But we must go further still. The challenge of delivering the housing we so desperately need in the places where it is currently least affordable is not, of course, a new one, but the effect of unaffordable housing on our nation's productivity makes it an urgent one. My right honourable friend, the Communities Secretary, will bring forward a housing white paper in due course addressing these long-term challenges. But in the meantime, we can take further steps. One of the biggest objections to housing development, as honourable and right honourable members will know from their own constituencies, is often the impact on local infrastructure. So we will focus government infrastructure investment to unlock land for housing, with a new £2.3 billion housing infrastructure fund to deliver infrastructure for up to 100,000 new homes in areas of high demand. And to provide affordable housing that supports a wide range of need, we will invest a further £1.4 billion to deliver 40,000 additional affordable homes. And I will also relax restrictions on government grant to allow providers to deliver a wider range of housing types. I can also announce a large-scale regional pilot of right to buy for housing association tenants and continued support for home ownership through the Help to Buy equity loan scheme and the Help to Buy ISA. Mr. Speaker, this package means that over the course of this Parliament, the Government expects to more than double, in real terms, annual capital spending on housing. Coupled with our resolve to tackle the long-term challenges of land supply, this commitment to housing delivery represents a step change in our ambition to increase the supply of homes for sale and for rent, to deliver a housing market that works for everyone. Mr. Speaker, reliable transport networks are essential to growth and productivity. So this autumn statement commits significant additional funding to help keep Britain moving now and to invest in the transport networks and vehicles of the future. I will commit an additional £1.1 billion of investment in English local transport networks, where small investments can often offer big wins. £220 million additionally to address traffic pinch points on strategic roads, £450 million to trial digital signalling on our railways to achieve a step change in reliability and to squeeze more capacity out of our existing rail infrastructure, something I know the Leader of the Opposition will welcome. And finally, Mr. Speaker, £390 million to build on our competitive advantage in low-emission vehicles and the development of connected autonomous vehicles, plus 100% first-year capital allowance for the installation of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. The Department for Transport will continue to work with Transport for the North to develop detailed options for the Northern Powerhouse Rail, and my Right Honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, will set out more details of specific projects and priorities over the coming weeks. Mr. Speaker, our future transport, business and lifestyle needs will require world-class digital infrastructure to underpin them. So my ambition is for, it says here because I wrote it here. So my ambition, Mr. Speaker, is for the UK to be a world leader in 5G. That means a full fibre network, a step change in speed, security and reliability. So we will invest over £1 billion in our digital infrastructure to catalyse private investment in fibre networks and to support 5G trials. And from April, we will introduce 100% business rates relief for a 5-year period on new fibre infrastructure, supporting further rollout of fibre to homes and businesses. We have chosen, Mr. Speaker, to borrow to kickstart a transformation in infrastructure and innovation investment. But we must sustain this effort over the long term if we're to make a lasting difference to the UK's productivity performance. So today I have written to the National Infrastructure Commission to ask them to make their recommendations on the future infrastructure needs of the country using the assumption that the government will invest between 1% and 1.2% of GDP every year from 2020 in economic infrastructure covered by the Commission. To put that in context, we'll spend around 0.8% of GDP on the same definition this year. I am also backing the Commission's interim recommendations on the Oxford-Cambridge Growth Corridor published last week, with £110 million of funding for East West Rail and a commitment to deliver the new Oxford to Cambridge Expressway. But, Mr. Speaker, this project can be more than just a transport link. It can become a transformational tech corridor drawing on the world-class research strengths of our two best-known universities. So I welcome the Commission's continuing work on delivery model options, and we will carefully consider its final recommendations in due course. The major increase in infrastructure spending I've announced today will represent a significant increase in funding through the Barnett formula of over £250 million to the Northern Ireland Executive, £400 million to the Welsh Government and £800 million to the Scottish Government. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure he will in a moment. But, Mr. Speaker, public investment is only part of the picture. About half of our economic infrastructure is financed by the private sector, and we will continue to support that investment through the UK Guarantee Scheme, which I am today extending until at least 2026. The new capital investment I've announced will provide the financial backbone for the government's industrial strategy, which the Prime Minister spoke about on Monday, a firm foundation upon which my Right Honourable friend, the Business Secretary, will work with industry to build our ambition of an economy that works for all. And I can announce 4 further measures to back business. I'm doubling UK export finance capacity to make it easier for British businesses to export. I'm funding Charlie Mayfield's business-led initiative to boost management skills across British businesses. And I'm taking a first step to tackle the long-standing problem of our fastest-growing start-up tech firms being snapped up by bigger companies rather than growing to scale by injecting an initial £400 million into venture capital funds through the British Business Bank, unlocking £1 billion of new finance for growing firms. And I'm also launching today a Treasury-led review of the barriers to accessing patient capital in the UK so that we can take further action to address them. Mr. Speaker, this government recognises that for too long economic growth in our country has been too concentrated in London and the South East. That is not just a social problem, it's an economic problem. London is one of the highest productivity cities in the world, and we should celebrate that fact. But no other major developed economy has such a gap between the productivity of its capital city and its second and third cities. So we must drive up the performance of our regional cities. Today we publish our strategy for addressing productivity barriers in the Northern Powerhouse and give the go-ahead to a programme of major road schemes in the north. Our Midlands Engine strategy will follow shortly, but I am today providing funding so that the evaluation study for the Midlands Rail Hub can go ahead. In addition, we are investing in local infrastructure in every region of England. I can announce the allocation of £1.8 billion from the Local Growth Fund to the English regions, £556 million to local enterprise partnerships in the north of England, £542 million to the Midlands and East of England, and £683 million to LEPs in the South West, South East and London. We will announce the detailed breakdown of allocations to individual LEPs shortly. Devolution, Mr. Speaker, remains at the heart of this government's approach to supporting local growth, and we recommit today to our city deals with Swansea, Edinburgh, North Wales and Tay cities. And I can announce today that we are beginning negotiations on a city deal for Stirling so that every single city in Scotland will be on course to have a city deal. To support new mayoral combined authorities in England, I can announce that we will grant them new borrowing powers to reflect their new responsibilities. And while we continue discussions with London and the West Midlands on possible devolution of further powers, I can announce today that London will receive £3.15 billion as its share of national affordable housing funding to deliver a commitment of over 90,000 affordable homes, and also that we are devolving to London the adult education budget and giving London greater control over the delivery of employment support services for the hardest to help. Mr. Speaker, I have deliberately avoided making this statement into a long list of individual projects being supported. But I am going to make one exception. I will act today with just 7 days to spare to save one of the UK's most important historic houses, Wentworth Woodhouse near Rotherham. It is said to be the inspiration for Pemberley in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. But in 1946, in an extraordinary act of cultural vandalism, the then Labour government authorised extensive open-cast coal mining virtually up to the front door of this precious property. Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, that's Labour's idea of a northern powerhouse. Wentworth Woodhouse is now at critical risk of being lost to future
house. It sounds very interesting indeed. Chancellor.
Wentworth Woodhouse, Mr. Speaker, is now at critical risk of being lost to future generations. A local effort has been hugely successful in securing millions of pounds in funding from various foundations and charities, subject to the balance required to make the house safe being found by November 30th. So we will today provide a £7.6 million grant towards urgent repairs to safeguard this key piece of northern heritage, all but destroyed by a Labour government, saved by a Conservative one. I can also, Mr. Speaker, confirm distribution of a further £102 million of LIBOR bank fines to armed forces and emergency services charities, including, my honourable friends will be pleased to hear, £20 million to support the Defence and National Rehabilitation Centre at Stamford Hall in Nottinghamshire, as well as £3 million from the tampon tax fund for comic relief to distribute to a range of women's charities. Mr. Speaker, we choose to invest in our economic infrastructure because it can transform the growth potential of our economy, as well as improving the quality of people's lives. But that investment is only possible because we on this side of the House are prepared to take the tough decisions to maintain control of current spending, every one of them opposed by the party opposite. When we took office in 2010, public spending was 45% of GDP. This year, it is set to be 40%. And during those 6 years, we've seen crime fall by more than a quarter, the highest proportion ever of good or outstanding schools. The number of doctors has increased by 10,000 in our NHS, pensioner poverty at its lowest level ever, the lowest ever number of children being raised in workless households, and the highest ever number of young people going on to study full-time at university. We have demonstrated beyond doubt that controlling public spending is compatible with world-class public services and social improvement. But as the OBR's debt projections demonstrate, we have more work to do to eliminate the deficit. So departmental spending plans set out in the spending review last autumn will remain in place, and departmental expenditure in 21-22 will grow in line with inflation. The £3.5 billion of savings to be delivered through the efficiency review announced at the budget and led by my right honourable friend the Chief Secretary must be delivered in full. I have, however, exceptionally agreed to provide additional funding to the Ministry of Justice to tackle urgent prison safety issues, increasing the number of prison officers by 2,500. Mr. Speaker, having run two large spending departments in previous roles, I came to this job with some very clear views about the relationship between the Treasury and spending departments. I want departments to be incentivised to drive efficiencies, and I want the Treasury to be an enabler for good, effective spending across government. To kickstart this new approach, I will allow up to £1 billion of the savings found by the efficiency review to be reinvested in 1920 in priority areas, and I have budgeted today accordingly. Mr. Speaker, we manage public spending so that we can invest in the public's priorities, and this government has underlined those priorities with a series of commitments and protections for the duration of this Parliament. And I can confirm today that despite the fiscal pressure, we will meet our commitments to protect the budgets of key public services and defence. We will keep our promise to the world's poorest through our overseas aid budget, and we will meet our pledge to our country's pensioners through the triple lock. But as we look ahead to the next Parliament, we will need to ensure that we tackle the challenges of rising longevity and fiscal sustainability. And so the government will review public spending priorities and other commitments for the next Parliament in light of the evolving fiscal position at the next spending review. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to taxation. Since 2010, this government has put a business-led recovery at the heart of our plan. We've cut corporation tax from 28% to 20%, sending the message that Britain is open for business. The additional investment in productivity and infrastructure that I've announced today underscores that message, and the raft of investments in the UK announced since the referendum by SoftBank, Glaxo, Nissan, Google and Apple, amongst others, confirms it. My priority as Chancellor is to ensure that Britain remains the #1 destination for business, creating the investment, the jobs and the prosperity to protect our long-term future. I know how much business values certainty and stability, and so I confirm today that we will stick to the business tax roadmap that we set out in March. Corporation tax will fall to 17%, by far the lowest overall rate of corporate tax in the G20. We will deliver the commitments we have made to the oil and gas sector. The carbon price support will continue to be capped out to 2020, and we will implement the business rates reduction package worth £6.7 billion. Now, I can also confirm today that, having consulted further, my Right Honourable friend, the Communities Secretary, will lower the transitional relief cap from 45% next year to 43% and from 50% to 32% the year after. That's complicated, but it's good news. Just in case anybody wasn't sure, Mr. Speaker. And I will also increase the rural rate relief to 100%, giving small businesses in rural areas a tax break worth up to £2,900 per year. But, Mr. Speaker, in return for these highly competitive tax rates, the tax base must be sustainable. From April 2017, we will align the employee and employer national insurance thresholds at £157 per week. There will be no cost to employees, and the maximum cost to business will be an annual £7.18 per employee. Insurance premium tax in this country is lower than in many other European countries and half the rate of VAT. In order to raise revenue, which is required to fund the spending commitments I am making today, it will rise from 10% currently to 12% from next June. At the same time, I can confirm that the government's commitment to legislate next year to end the compensation culture surrounding whiplash claims, a major area of insurance fraud, and that will save drivers an average of £40 on their annual premiums. Mr. Speaker, technological progress is changing the way people live and the way they work. The tax system needs to keep pace. For example, the OBR has highlighted today the growing cost to the Exchequer of incorporation. So the government will consider how we can ensure that the taxation of different ways of working is fair between different individuals doing essentially the same work and sustains the tax base as the economy undergoes rapid change. We will consult in due course on any proposed changes. In the meantime, the government will take action now to reduce the difference between the treatment of cash earnings and benefits. The majority of employees pay tax on a cash salary, but some are able to sacrifice salary by agreement with their employer and pay much lower tax on benefits in kind. This is unfair, and so from April 2017, employers and employees who use these schemes will pay the same taxes as everyone else. Following consultation with stakeholders, ultra-low emission cars, pension savings, childcare and the Cycle to Work scheme will be excluded from this change. And certain long-term arrangements will be protected until April 2021. For pensions that have been drawn down, I will also reduce to £4,000 the money purchase annual allowance to prevent inappropriate double tax relief being gained. This government, Mr. Speaker, has done more than any other to tackle tax evasion, avoidance and aggressive tax planning. And the UK tax gap, it may surprise some honourable members opposite to hear, is now one of the lowest in the world. But we must constantly be alert to new threats to our tax base and be willing to move swiftly to counter them. At the budget, we committed to removing the tax benefits of disguised earnings for employees, and I am now going to do the same for the self-employed and employers, raising a further £630 million over the forecast period. We will shut down inappropriate use of the VAT flat rate scheme that was put in place to help small businesses. We will abolish the tax advantages linked to employee shareholder status in response to growing evidence that it is being primarily used for tax planning purposes by high-earning individuals. And we will introduce a new penalty for those who enable the use of a tax avoidance scheme that HMRC later challenges and defeats. These measures and others set out in the autumn statement document raise around £2 billion over the forecast period. Mr. Speaker, there is understandable public concern that the pitch is tilted in favour of large multinational groups which are able to use cross-border structures to manage their tax liabilities. Following detailed consultation, I can confirm that we will implement our new restriction on tax relief for corporate interest expenses and reform the way that relief is provided for historic losses. These measures, scored at Budget 2016, will help to ensure large businesses will always pay tax in years where they make substantial profits. They will also mean that businesses cannot avoid tax by borrowing excessively in the UK to fund their overseas activities. They take effect in April and raise over £5 billion from the largest businesses in the UK. Mr. Speaker, I said that the tax system must be fair, and that means rewarding those who work hard by helping them to keep more of what they earn. And there is one tax reform this government has pursued since 2010 that has done more than any other to improve the lot of working people: raising the tax-free personal allowance. When we entered government in 2010, it was £6,475. Now, after 6 years, it is £11,000 and will rise to £11,500 in April. As a result, we have more than halved the tax bill of someone with a salary of £15,000 to just £800. That is a massive boost to the incomes of low and middle earners. Since 2010, we've cut income tax for 28 million people and taken 4 million people out of income tax altogether. And I can confirm today that despite the challenging fiscal forecasts, we will deliver on our commitment to raising the allowance to £12,500 and the higher rate threshold to £50,000 by the end of this Parliament. Once that £12,500 has been reached, Mr. Speaker, the personal allowance will rise automatically during the 2020s in line with inflation, rather than the national minimum wage as currently planned. It will be for the Chancellor to decide from year to year whether more is affordable. As well as taking millions of ordinary people out of tax, we are the government that introduced the national living wage and gave a pay rise, Mr. Speaker, to over 1 million workers. They don't like it. A Tory government gave a pay rise to over 1 million of the lowest paid workers. We are the government that introduced 15 hours a week of free childcare for all 3- and 4-year-olds and will double that for working families from September. The government whose education reforms have raised standards and expanded opportunity with 1.4 million more children now in good or outstanding schools. And the new capital funding that I've provided today for grammar schools will help to continue that trend. And we, Mr. Speaker, are the government that pledged to invest in our NHS, and we are delivering on that promise, backing the NHS 5-year forward view plan for the future with £10 billion of additional funding by the end of 2020-2021. But we recognise that more needs to be done to help families make ends meet and to ensure every household has opportunities to prosper. So today I can announce that the national living wage will increase from £7.20 to £7.50 in April next year. That's a pay rise worth over £500 a year to a full-time worker. Mr. Speaker, creating jobs, lowering taxes and raising wages addresses directly the concerns of ordinary families. And the revenue-raising measures that I've announced today enable me to go further to help families on low wages. Universal credit is an important reform to our benefit system and is designed to make sure that work always pays. We want to reinforce that position. I have considered very carefully the arguments made by my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green, by my honourable friend, the member for Enfield Southgate, and others, and weighed them carefully against the fiscal constraints we are facing. I have concluded that from April, we can reduce the universal credit taper rate from 65% to 63%. This is effectively a targeted tax cut worth £700 million a year by 21-22 for those in work on low incomes. It will increase the incentive to work and encourage progression in work, and it will help 3 million households across our country. Mr. Speaker, we believe that a market economy is the best way of delivering sustained prosperity for the British people. We will always support a market-led approach, but we will not be afraid to intervene where there is evidence of market failure. We will look carefully over the coming months at the functioning of key markets, including the retail energy market, to make sure they are functioning fairly for all consumers. And in the private rental market, letting agents are currently able to charge unregulated fees to tenants. We've seen these fees spiral, despite attempts to regulate them, often to hundreds of pounds. This is wrong. Landlords appoint letting agents and landlords should meet their fees. So I can announce today that we will ban fees to tenants as soon as possible. And also, Mr. Speaker, we will consult on how best to ban pensions cold calling and a wider range of pension scams. We can also help today those who rely on income from modest savings to get by. Low interest rates have helped our economy recover, but they've significantly reduced the interest people can earn on their cash savings. So we will launch a new market-leading savings bond through NS&I. The detail will be announced at the budget, but we expect our new investment bond will have an interest rate of around 2.2% gross and a term of 3 years. Savers will be able to deposit up to £3,000, and we expect around 2 million people to benefit. Mr. Speaker, the announcements I have made today lower taxes on working people, boost wages, back savers, and bear down on bills. In early 2017, we will begin the rollout of tax-free childcare across Britain, providing a saving of up to £2,000 per child. And once it's rolled out, we pledge to keep it under review to ensure that it is indeed delivering the support they need to working families. There is one further area of household expenditure where the government can help. The oil price has risen by over 60% since January, and sterling has declined by 15% against the dollar. That means, of course, significant pressure on prices at the pumps here in Britain. So today, we stand on the side of millions of hard-working people in our country by cancelling the fuel duty rise for the 7th successive year. In total, this saves the average car driver £130 a year and the average van driver £350 a year. This is a tax cut worth £850 million next year, Mr. Speaker, and means the current fuel duty freeze is the longest for 40 years. Mr. Speaker, I have one further announcement to make. This is my first autumn statement as Chancellor. After careful consideration and detailed discussion with the Prime Minister, I have decided that it will also be my last. Mr. Speaker, I am abolishing the autumn statement. No other major economy makes hundreds of tax changes twice a year, and neither should we. So the spring budget in a few months will be the final spring budget. Starting in autumn 2017, Britain will have an autumn budget announcing tax changes well in advance of the start of the tax year. From 2018, there will be a spring statement responding to the forecast. Perhaps they should have read their briefing, Mr. Speaker.
A great state of emotion. Some people are very easily humoured. I'm glad to see they're so humoured. But we must hear the Chancellor. Chancellor.
Perhaps they should have read their briefing, Mr. Speaker, because they might remember that Parliament has mandated the Office of Budget Responsibility to produce a report to Parliament twice a year and has mandated the government to reply to it. So from 2018, there will be a spring statement responding to the forecast from the OBR, but no major fiscal event. If unexpected changes in the economy require it, I will, of course, reserve the right to announce actions at the spring statement, but I will not make significant changes twice a year just for the sake of it. This change will allow for greater parliamentary scrutiny of budget measures ahead of their implementation. Mr. Speaker, this is a long overdue reform to our tax policy making process and brings the UK into line with best practice recommended by the IMF, the IFS, Institute for Government and many others. Mr. Speaker, the OBR report today confirms the underlying strength and resilience of the British economy. This autumn statement responds to the challenge of building on that strength while also heeding the warnings in the OBR's figures as we begin writing this new chapter in our country's history. It restates our commitment to living within our means, and it sets out our choice to invest in our future. It sends a clear message to the world that Britain is open for business, and it provides help to those who need it now. So, Mr. Speaker, we have made our choices. We have set our course. We are a great nation, bold in our vision, confident in our strengths, and determined in our ambition to build a country that works for everyone. I commend this statement.
So that was the Chancellor. Excuse me. This is now the Shadow Chancellor's response.
This morning, Mr. Speaker, this morning we've heard the verdict from the trial following the tragic murder of Joe Cox. Joe Cox's murder robbed this House of a fierce advocate for social justice and a passionate campaigner. Her killing was an attack on democracy itself. Our thoughts are with her family this morning. Mr. Speaker, today's statement places on record the abject failure of the last 6 wasted years and offers no hope for the future. The figures speak for themselves. Growth down, wage growth down, business investment down, and their own deficit target failed. The debt target failed. The welfare cap failed. We've heard today, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Let me just say now, if members on either side want to shout out, don't bother to stand because you won't be called. I say that to members on both sides. Stop it. It's juvenile, low grade and hugely deprecated by the public, whose support we should be seeking and whom we should try to impress, not to repel. John McDonnell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard today there'll be more taxes, more debt and more borrowing. The verdict could not be clearer. The so-called long-term economic plan has failed. And as the Treasury's own leaked paper revealed, the government knew it had failed before the referendum result was announced. And we now face Brexit, the greatest economic challenge of a generation, and we face it unprepared and ill-equipped. The new Chancellor acknowledged the failure himself in October of the economic strategy when he promised a reset of economic policy. So today we expected a change of direction after those 6 wasted years. Instead, we've seen further cuts to earnings for those in work through cuts to universal credit and a living wage increase that is lower than expected under the previous Chancellor. This is a new Conservative leadership with no answers to the challenges facing our country following Brexit and no vision to secure our future prosperity. Just turning to Brexit, Labour respects the decision of the British people to leave the European Union, but the chaotic Tory handling of Brexit threatens the future prosperity of this country. The Chancellor must now do the right thing for British workers and businesses. He must insist on full tariff-free access to the single market. He and the Treasury know that's what will give the best deal for jobs and prosperity here. I just say it may not be in the Chancellor's nature, but in the national interest, I urge him to stand up to the Prime Minister and the extreme Brexit fanatics in her cabinet. If he stands up for British businesses and jobs in fighting for single market access, he will have our full support. But after 6 wasted years, wages are still lower than 2008. Self-employed people are on average paid less than a generation ago. 6 million people are earning less than the living wage. Too many people are having to worry about buying school uniforms, affording a family holiday, or even just paying the rent or mortgage. We've had a month of briefing from the party opposite on those people who are called just about managing, the jams. To the party opposite, these people are just an electoral demographic. To us, they're our friends, our neighbours and the people we represent. Let me tell you what they are, why they are just managing. Why are they just managing? It's the results of Tories imposing austerity on an economy that couldn't bear the strain. We've seen productivity stagnate, but there's nothing in this autumn statement on the scale needed to overturn those 6 wasted years. If the Chancellor really wants to make a fair tax system as well, he can start by bringing back the 50p rate for the very richest in our country. And it is familiar, hollow rhetoric from the Tories on tax avoidance when they've cut the resources at HMRC, the very people there staffed to collect the taxes themselves. Resources available to HMRC today are 40% less than they were in 2000. The Chancellor has frozen in-work benefits at a time when food prices are rising and we don't expect wages to keep up. We need an economy that is fundamentally more prosperous and where that prosperity is, yes, shared by all. The increase in the national living wage announced today are actually lower than expected and leave the poorest paid workers still earning less than they need to live on. So I ask the Chancellor to adopt a real living wage level, as Labour has pledged to do, and abandon his predecessor's empty rhetoric. Regrettably, the Chancellor is still going ahead with some of the cuts to universal credit. Thanks to the pressure, and I pay tribute to those MPs on all sides of the House who've campaigned on this issue, thanks to that pressure, he's offering to soften the blow. We do not want the blow softened, we want it lifted altogether. Today's changes will leave a single parent on average at least £2,300 worse off. These are the very people who are working hard to deliver for their families, and the government is betraying them. As for the people with disabilities put through the ordeal of the discredited work capability assessment, who are trying to get themselves ready to return to work just about managing, they still remain in the Chancellor's firing line, cutting £30 a week from the support that these disabled people receive. It is scandalous in our society. Those who are just about managing also rely upon our public services. They send their children to local schools. They depend on their local hospital. They rely on their council services like cleaning the streets, tending to their parks and playgrounds, and opening their libraries. But the reality is, after 6 wasted years, our public services are just not managing. Today, the childcare that parents rely upon remains underfunded, as the Public Accounts Committee has reported. and it will remain underfunded even after the announcements today. I want to pay tribute as well to the honourable members for Swansea East and Erith and Thamesmead for their important work in bringing the issue of child burial fees to the public attention. And I ask the government to do the right thing on child burial fees and reconsider making funding available for families in these desperate circumstances. Councillors from all political parties are reporting that they are at a tipping point in the provision of social care. The previous Chancellor cut nearly £5 billion from social care, meaning now that over 1 million people who need care aren't getting it. They're not even just about managing, and they've got little help today. We call for additional support for social care. But the funding being provided today is only a stopgap measure. Our social care system will not be secure without long-term funding. Tonight, many elderly people will remain trapped in their homes, isolated and lonely, lacking the care they need because of this continuing cuts to social care. You can't cut social care without also hitting the NHS. The supposed £10 billion funding allocated is a restatement of an earlier commitment, but the Health Select Committee described this £10 billion claim as, and I quote, misleading and incorrect. The real amount is less than half that claimed. The result? We now have 3.9 million people on NHS waiting lists, more than ever. Many of those 3.9 people are waiting in pain, and they got no relief today. No relief today. Across the country, hospitals are facing losing their accident emergency units, losing their maternity units, and losing their specialist units. This Tory government is failing patients and also failing the dedicated NHS staff that serve us so well. This is the first time healthcare spending per head has declined since the NHS was created. And I fear there will be a crisis in funding and care over this Christmas. The NHS cares for us. We should care for the NHS. On education, members of this government have also overseen the biggest real terms cuts in education for 4 decades. £1 in every 7 has been cut from FE college budgets, and Conservative policy has saddled a generation of students with a lifetime of debt. How can a government seriously talk about supporting a 21st century economy when they're planning to pour tens of millions into the failed 20th century policy of grammar schools, segregating our children at an early age? On housing, the Chancellor has announced today that he's scrapping pay-to-stay proposals and letting agents' fees. This U-turn is a victory for Labour's campaigning against both the tenant tax and letting fees. The Chancellor has spoken before of the dream of home ownership for the young. Nothing announced today is of the scale needed to suggest it will remain anything other than a dream. The hard facts are these. The government of which he was a member built fewer homes than at any point since the 1920s. There are now 1,300,000 fewer homeowners under 35. The Chancellor today could have delivered the scale of investment required to build the homes we need and create a new generation of home ownership. He significantly failed. I'm grateful that as a result of the campaign from the Honourable Member for Wentworth and Dean that the Wentworth and Woodhouse building will be saved. I'm grateful. The accusation was that a Labour government opened an open-cast mine near to it and threatened it. That was the Labour government, I believe, in 1947. I just wish some of the policies pursued by Tory governments since the 1950s could be reversed so easily. The biggest failure of investment is this. The Chancellor has failed to address properly this government's most consistent shortcoming. His predecessor cut public investment to the lowest it's been since the 1990s. Instead of delivering the ambitious investment this economy needs across the whole country, the Chancellor has failed to recognise the scale of the challenge today. He also risked repeating the mistakes from last year with the National Flood Resilience Plan, failing to provide the protection our communities need. Just 1 in 5 of the projects in the investment pipeline are under construction, and there are 82 billion of shovel-ready projects still delayed. The infrastructure gap between London and the rest remains unbridged. London was scheduled to receive 12 times the public investment per head of the north east of England. But the 1.1 billion of investment in transport is a re-announcement. The Oxford to Cambridge rail link is significantly delayed against Network Rail's original planned completion date of March 2019. There are just no new ideas here, just a promise to deliver what they previously failed to deliver on. This is press release policy making and not provision. And all we need now is the return of the high-vis jacket. The fourth industrial revolution will not be delivered. The fourth industrial revolution will not be delivered on delays, on old news and re-announcements. At last, the government has realised its mistake and now talk about an industrial strategy, words that ministers refused to even refer to in the past. But it isn't enough just to change a few ministerial titles. The government and the Chancellor need to deliver. But we've yet to see the proposed Green Paper on industrial strategy that was promised over the summer. The same government that now talks also of high-tech investment oversaw a £1 billion cut in real terms to science funding in the last Parliament. The OECD recommends that developed countries should be spending 3% of GDP on science. And what we've heard today, the new spending will lift our expenditure from 1.7% of GDP to a mere 1.8%. And it's the same familiar story for business. The Chancellor is continuing the race to the bottom on corporation tax. While continuing to cut the cuts to public services, the Chancellor is cutting taxes to big business. We know it's not the headline tax rates that encourage long-term investment from businesses. Business investment has been revised down every year under this government. What encourages business investment is knowing they have access to skilled workers, to world-class infrastructure and to major markets. Today's grim economic forecasts show the challenge ahead. The Chancellor admitted over the summer that it was time for a change of course. He has now had to abandon his government's fiscal charter with its failed hard surplus target. Labour warned that a hard surplus target lacks the flexibility to adapt to economic circumstances and the capacity to allow investment. The Chancellor's U-turn today demonstrates just how right we've been over this last year. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, only weeks ago, the Prime Minister offered a hope of change. The Chancellor offered to reset economic policy. Today, we've seen the very people the Prime Minister promised to champion betrayed. The Chancellor has failed to break with the economic strategy of austerity. The country remains unprepared and ill-equipped to meet the challenges of Brexit and secure Britain's future as a world-leading economy. After all the sacrifices people have made over the last 6 years, I fear today's statement has laid the foundations for more wasted years. Only a Labour government will deliver on the ambition and vision to rebuild and transform our economy so that no one and no community is left behind.
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I first associate myself with his remarks?
So we leave the House of Commons, but debate on the autumn statement continues in the chamber. If you want uninterrupted coverage of that, you can get it on BBC Parliament. But let's take a moment now to take you through the headlines from the autumn statement. And we start with the growth forecast because they were the most significant, and a lot follows from this. They're now forecasting growth of 2.1% this year, 1.4 next, 1.7. Then it goes back to 2.1, 2.1, and of course 2021, they don't really know, but they say 2% there. So a dip the next 2 years, back to more like trend, 2% in the outer years. Because of that dip, there are implications for borrowing, and at every year coming up, the Chancellor has now forecast more borrowing. 68 billion in 2016-17, that's this year, much more than forecast, then 59, then 46.5, then 21.20. Cumulatively, that is well over £100 billion he plans to borrow between now and the start of the next decade. And it then follows because of that. That, of course, government debt rises. You borrow more, it all adds to the national debt. National debt is now going to peak at 90% of GDP, just over, by 2017-18. So that means that 12 years after the great crash, debt is still rising and only begins to fall after that. 12 years of rising debt as a percentage of GDP. The new target for debt now, though it's an old one as well, we've had before and was broken, is to see it falling as a share of GDP by the end of this Parliament. So it peaks up to 90%, it's a lot of GDP, and then begins to start to fall in the out years. Cyclically adjusted borrowing should be below 2%, says the Chancellor, by 2020. So he doesn't get to a surplus, but he begins to start getting control of the deficit and getting it down again. Number of measures were announced that affect individual and household budgets. The national living wage will rise to £7.50 an hour next April. Fuel duty rise is cancelled. That seems to happen every year now. Universal credit taper, it's a sort of marginal rate of tax that people on welfare and who are working pay when they lose their benefits and get a bit more pay. That's reduced by a very small amount, from 65% to 63. So you'll still lose 63 pence for every extra pound you earn. And what was leaked in the papers this morning, the upfront letting agency fees are banned in England. They've already been banned in Scotland. Number of tax announcements too. Corporation tax will fall, as the government has told us before, to 17%. It's currently, I think, 20 or maybe 19 that they just reduced it to, but it's going down to 17. He hopes to raise another 2 billion by targeting more tax avoidance schemes. That tends to be mentioned now in every budget or autumn statement. And because he's looking at ways to raise more money and not see that deficit rise by even more or have to borrow more, he's increased the insurance premium tax to increase from 10 to 12%. So you'll pay more tax on your insurance premiums from June of next year. Then on housing. We were told there'll be a number of announcements on housing. He's putting in 1.4 billion to help build 40,000 new affordable homes. That, of course, is not in a year. That's spread over time. This year, there was a very small number of affordable homes built. He's also announced a 2.3 billion housing infrastructure fund. He hopes that will build 100,000 new homes in areas in high demand. Again, that is spread over a number of years. And right to buy was a policy of the previous Chancellor and of the Prime Minister. They're not going ahead across the country. They're going to look at what he calls a large-scale regional pilot to allow housing association tenants to buy their homes. And then on transport, he's a former transport secretary, so we expected a fair bit on transport. He announced a 1.3 billion package to improve English local transport. Sounds a lot. It's only 0.08% of GDP. There'll be 450 million for a trial of digital signalling on railways, 390 for low-emission vehicles. The kind of thing that chancellors always like to, how should we put it, pad out their budgets or their autumn statements. There are consequences for these announcements for the rest of the UK. Under the devolution settlements, Northern Ireland will get an extra 250 million a year, Wales 400, and Scotland 800 million a year. There is to be 1.8 billion from local growth funds for infrastructure in the English regions. Again, the Chancellor talked a lot about infrastructure. New borrowing powers for mayoral combined authorities. The government trying to encourage the big cities to have elected mayors and then saying if you do that and combine, we're going to let you borrow more. For business, the Chancellor announced that there was a £6.7 billion package to reduce business rates. This £23 billion for the new Productivity Investment Fund over 5 years. How much of that is new money, we will discuss. Of course, it works out at about 4.5 billion a year. Looks a lot bigger when you say it's 23 billion. And there will be an extra 400 million to unlock £1 billion of funding for startup tech schemes. Again, the kind of announcement that we are used to seeing in these sort of events. On other measures, and there were quite a lot of measures, the Chancellor had said he wasn't going to make it a big deal. Actually, it was quite a big deal. £1 billion funding for digital infrastructure, including 5G mobile. Infrastructure investment is to rise to between 1 and 1.2% of GDP from 2020. That will still leave the United Kingdom quite low by international standards on infrastructure investment as a share of GDP. And what we'd already heard from the Prime Minister, an extra £2 billion a year for research and development by 2020. So it slowly builds up in the rest of this decade to another £2 billion for R&D. Again, kind of infrastructure, productivity, trying to invest in the future. The Chancellor also announced that that was the last autumn statement. So quite a historic event, you might think. But then he said instead there would now be a spring statement starting next year. So what you may ask of the budget? Well, the budget's moving to the autumn. So in a way, nothing much really changes. We still have a statement and a budget, one each every year. Laura Kuenssberg, Kamal Ahmed are with us. We're also joined by the man who gets to mark the Chancellor's homework, and we're going to come to him in a minute, Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Laura, give me your overview of what we've just heard.
Well, I think, look, it was a low-key presentation from a low-key Chancellor, but with actually quite a dramatic picture behind it. That dramatic picture that instead of being in the black, as was expected by the end of this Parliament, we will actually, as a country, be much more in the red. That surplus is gone and actually will be well over more than 20 billion of that deficit still hanging around like a bad smell, crucially, as we head into the next general election, if these forecasts are right. So, you know, borrowing is back. This looks very different to the plan that George Osborne, big time, very different to the plan that George Osborne put forward just a few short months ago. The straight jacket on public spending is a bit looser. Those new rules, not that different to Ed Miliband's rules, it has to be said. And, you know, Philip Hammond made a real concerted effort to try to show this long-term plan, this long-term infrastructure, his long-term ambitions for the economy. There was a concerted effort too to make this add up to some kind of political narrative. But I'm not sure really how convincing this is as a set of measures that will really help people out there who, as Theresa May has identified, are just managing to get by. Nothing very dramatic on the giveaway side. A lot of drama on how the picture has changed.
Kamal, the thing that struck me is that he's now saying growth will, or the OBR is now saying economic growth will be 2.1% this year. That's quite healthy. But then it falls to 1.4 next year. They forecast 1.7 the year after. Then it rises back up again to over 2%. His financial position deteriorates because of the two coming years. If the OBR is wrong, and if the forecast, if it turns out that growth stays at around 2%, almost every one of these figures he's given us today will turn out not to be true.
Well, you're absolutely right, Andrew. Of course, these are only forecasts, and we are in this incredibly uncertain period of time. I think, just as Laura says, this wasn't a autumn statement about giveaways or about microeconomic issues, but it was huge in macro terms. I mean, those new debt to GDP ratios are very high, going over 90% in 3 years' time, showing that the government is going to have to borrow a lot more. Its total borrowing amount by the end of the forecast period will be just under £2 trillion. Now, if our economy
just under
if our economy grows rapidly, I've had a few tweets this morning. If our economy grows rapidly, and lots of economists say it is perfectly sustainable, not maybe at 90%, but to say as long as you have a falling proportion of debt in proportion to your GDP, that is sustainable. What the government has, though, done as well is those new targets for what Philip Hammond said were balancing the books are flexible, to put it benignly. Could be possibly meaningless, to put it rather more aggressively. They said that they wanted to bring the budget back to balance as early as possible in the next Parliament. Well,
don't they all?
Yeah. One of those rather conditional words, possible, of course. One really interesting bit within the Office for Budget Responsibilities economic outlook is they have done a whole chapter on what they call the no referendum counterfactual. What would their forecast have looked like if we hadn't voted to leave the European Union?
What does it say?
And in there, it does say that directly related to the referendum result, it suggests that borrowing of £3.5 billion this year, nearly £10 billion next year, £15.4 billion 2018-19 is attributable to the referendum result, because it says that the referendum means that there will be this negative impact on the economy. The OBR, if it was concerned about plunging into that debate, well, what will effect Brexit have? It hasn't shown it in its work it's done. It's actually put some actual numbers on borrowing, stuck them on a table and said, right, everyone can now have an argument about that.
And there will be a huge argument and big discussion about how much of this picture changing is down to the vote to leave the European Union. But fascinatingly, right at the start of his statement, Philip Hammond placed it in that context. Almost in his first paragraph, he said that his statement would flow as a consequence from the decision that we've made. So he himself was quite clear the decisions he's made are down to the decision that we all made.
They do, sorry, just one other quick point. They do say that things like oil prices and other global growth issues are in this, but they do put the referendum front and central.
Paul, we were meant on the previous forecast to borrow just over 55 billion this financial year. It's now going to be 68, he says. Next year we were meant to borrow just under 39 billion. It's now going to be 59 billion. And so it goes on. Is this deterioration in our fiscal position worse than you thought it would be?
I mean, actually, I think the OBR has been relatively optimistic compared, for example, with the Bank of England. So the OBR's figures up to 2019-20 look a bit more optimistic rather than more pessimistic.
On the growth side.
On the growth side, and therefore on the public finances side. In terms of the public finances overall, their numbers are actually very close to the numbers that we put out a couple of weeks ago in terms of our expectations of borrowing going forward.
If they're a bit more optimistic on the growth side, and they may not be optimistic enough, time will tell, why does the borrowing deteriorate by so much? I mean, it's almost 20 billion behind where it was for the next couple of years.
Well, there's two things going on. The first is that borrowing is actually very sensitive to growth, so those aren't terribly surprising relationships. The other thing is that there is clearly, as the OBR state, there are other things going on which are creating problems, and in particular over this year, the Chancellor has got in less in income tax revenues than he expected to do, even given what's happened to growth and wages and so on. And one of the things that the OBR draw attention to, and indeed the Chancellor mentioned he was going to consult on, is this whole issue of what you might call the gig economy, but people who are no longer getting money as earnings, as PAYE earnings, but instead are self-employed or incorporating. And if you're self-employed, and particularly if you call yourself a small company, you pay quite a bit less tax than if you're an employee for the same amount of income. Something the OBR worried about in March. They seem to be worrying about it quite a lot more now. And one of the, in a sort of slightly nerdy way, one of the most interesting things the Chancellor said is he was going to consult on changing the tax system, or at least the way in which we define what is self-employed or incorporated, in response to that. And that could, in the long run, have quite a big effect.
The OBR's inflation figures are interesting because compared to the Bank of England, they're not that bad. They've got inflation peaking at 2.5% in 2018, which if wage growth was to stay the way it is now, about 2.3%, it would just be a little bit above. Then it falls back down to 2%. If that's true, you wouldn't get the same squeeze on real living standards that many had feared because of the fall of the pound, and therefore maybe not the same impact on growth. It wouldn't be so bad.
Well, clearly the higher the inflation is, then the worse that is for living standards, and the OBR, along with the bank, is expecting a direct pass-through into higher prices, a bit less, but actually not that much less than the bank is expecting. And if it does turn out that we get prices at 2.5% and wages at 2.3%, in historical terms, that's terrible. I mean, we usually see earnings rising 2% a year faster than prices, not 0.2% less fast than prices. And don't forget, I mean, we are, irrespective of what happened on June the 23rd, we've already had 7 or 8 years essentially with no growth in real earnings. And I haven't looked at I haven't looked at the specific numbers here, but it looks like we've got several more years of that, and we may well end up by the end of this decade with earnings no higher than they were at the beginning of the decade.
And that will have a huge impact on consumer spending.
Frankly, never seen that before, certainly not since the last war.
So is it clear from what you've been able to find out so far, for the just about managing, this new popular political phrase, is it clear that the just about managing are going to be any better off as a result of this?
There's not a lot here in terms of measures for that group. Now, we do, of course, have the national living wage rising to £7.50 an hour in April. That's quite a big increase on the minimum wage as it was a year ago, and that will help a lot in that group. Otherwise, we've got this small increase in the generosity of universal credit when it finally comes in, but nowhere near that's nowhere near offsets the cuts that were announced back in June 2015. No doubt we'll also be told that the, again, freezing fuel duties will help that group, though of course most of that money will go to better off people who tend to consume more fuel, more petrol. So there's not an enormous amount here, I think, for that just about managing group.
Well, we need to leave it there, but we thank you for our your initial reaction. We look forward to the more considered one tomorrow when you've had a chance to go through all the figures on that. Paul Johnson of the IFS there. Let's now get reaction to the Chancellor's statement from Simon Jack in the City. Simon.
Thanks very much indeed, Andrew. We've been monitoring the pound, usually the most sensitive market to political and economic announcements like this. And as you can see, as he started talking, the pound started rising. It's then started falling. We've ended up pretty much back where we were, which is a bit of a surprise, actually, because those borrowing numbers were a lot more horrible than we were actually expecting. £122 billion in more in debt over the 5-year period. And that announcement that debt as a percentage of GDP will hit 90% in 2017 to 2018. That's the highest it's been for 50 years. But given we were pretty gloomy about growth forecasts and how those borrowing numbers are very sensitive to those GDP numbers, perhaps the city was not that surprised and had braced itself for the worst. We can talk to Simon Walker, Director General of the Institute of Directors, and also to Sue Nofke, who runs a portfolio of UK equities. She picks stocks for Schroders here. And first of all, Sue, on that big picture, 90% debt to GDP looks like a horrible number.
It is a pretty horrible number, and that's why the giveaways have been very much constrained here. I think the surprising thing for me is the growth forecast into the future. Although there's a huge amount of uncertainty underpinning those, they're actually a little bit better than people had feared.
And yes, they are a little bit more optimistic than some had feared. Also, what was quite interesting in the OBR's statement was that they were looking at how they came up with those assumptions, factoring Brexit, because clearly this is the first time they've had to try and factor that in. And they were clearly saying in that actually thought trade volumes would be lower. So they were saying there would be a cost to Brexit.
Yes, I think that's what they are factoring in, as well as the higher inflation and the impact that will have on consumers' spending as well. So it's those two things combined, but maybe not as much of a hit as people had, certainly in the city, forecast for those numbers to be.
It's always thought that you've got to have a plan. You've got to have a credible plan about debt. And what he said today was he was going to balance the books as early as possible in the next Parliament. Is that good enough?
Well, we'll see from the sterling charts, unmoved. I think it's in a difficult position, trying to engender growth in a period of great uncertainty. We don't know quite what Brexit will bring, as well as all the global phenomenons that are going on. I think it's a tough ask.
Of course, there are other things other than Brexit affecting the dynamics of the economy. Well, let's talk about growth. You mentioned that there, Sue. And Simon Walker, a big emphasis on infrastructure and productivity. That presumably chimed with you.
I think it did. I mean, it's all tied together, and that figure about 30% less productive, Britain's 30% less productive than Germany or the United States, I mean, that says there's a real problem to be addressed. And I think what we know about this Chancellor is that addressing that is his number one priority. And a lot of what we've seen today is about that, and he kind of tied that into it. Infrastructure, digital, housing, transport, it all comes into that. We're a bit disappointed that there's nothing on capital allowances, nothing on the annual investment allowance, because that actually improves productivity too. And if I've got one complaint, it's that it's not as ambitious as it might have been. Ambition to invest here and now over the next year for businesses that are uncertain and a little bit hesitant because we're all being cautious.
One thing, his very last announcement, this will be the last autumn statement. It will now be an autumn budget next year, and we'll have a spring statement if you follow that logic. And this will be the big one, and we'll have a smaller announcement back over in spring. Now, presumably, if he doesn't tinker with things in spring, we have one big budget a year and that's about it. That in itself is good for business because this continual tinkering adds to the workload for businesses.
Yes, that is to be welcomed. I mean, the fact that we're going to an autumn budget also gives businesses much more time to plan for the incoming tax year than they've had with a spring budget. So I think that the fact that we're not going to have fiscal events, as they're called, coming up the whole time has to be an unqualified good.
Okay, and one thing I thought I heard was the sort of slight death knell of the triple lock there, saying that it was safe to the end of 2020, but given changes in longevity, it might need looking at. Did you hear that? That was the death knell for the triple lock on pensions?
I thought there was a definite hint of that it will be reviewed, and I think a recognition that this is just favouring a part of the community that's been favoured a lot over the last 10 years, and we need to address more to younger people struggling in their first houses.
And on the house building, no real surprises there. We got what we were expecting.
I think we did, and it will need to be a continuing priority. But we at the IOD have always said it's planning. It's freeing up planning regulation that will really help house building.
Okay, Sue and Simon, thank you very much indeed. So as I say, the markets really took this in their stride. Despite those horrible debt numbers out in 2018, people were expecting much gloomier growth forecasts. That's what the Chancellor gave them. But the city today was braced for that news.
Thank you, Simon. Let's speak to Philip Hammond's deputy at the Treasury. He's the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, David Gauck. Welcome to this special programme. So, we've got slower growth, higher inflation, weaker tax revenues, squeezed living standards, spectacularly higher borrowing. Where's the good news?
Well, it shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody that as we go through a period of uncertainty and transition following the Brexit vote, that there are challenges for the economy. I think the key thing is that the government responds as is necessary. We've given ourselves greater flexibility. We're taking steps to improve productivity, but we're also doing this in a way that maintains credibility in our public finances.
Well, how can it be credible when you're going to... This is only November. And in March of this year, you told us what you plan to borrow for the next 5 years. You're now going to borrow £122 billion more than you told us you would borrow only 6 or 7 months ago.
Well, that's the OBR's estimate, and the OBR is very clear in their explanation as to why that is. And they predominantly put that down to the consequences of the Brexit vote and the uncertainty that follows from that, leading to reduced investment and therefore slower growth over this period of time. There are also some structural challenges that we face that Paul Johnson was talking about a moment or so ago, about different ways of working and the fact that brings in fewer tax receipts than we would otherwise have. So yes, we do face some challenges, but the difference between March and November, well, quite a lot has happened between March and November. But the question is, how does the government respond?
Well, in 2010, you told us you would balance the budget by 2015. That didn't happen. By 2015, you told us you'd balance the budget by 2020. That's not going to happen. Now you can't tell us when it's going to be balanced, correct?
Well, circumstances have changed. Actually, the ABR says that had the Brexit vote gone the other way, they've produced a counterfactual, and they say we would still be on course to have a surplus by 2019-20. But the circumstances are now different, and we have to respond to those circumstances, and that's exactly what the Chancellor
Do you
set out
feel
today.
comfortable being in a government, supposedly a fiscally conservative government, that by the end of this decade will probably have increased the national debt to £2 trillion? £2 trillion.
Well, I think you have to look as to why that has happened, and the principal reason actually was that we were an inherited economy where we were borrowing records amount.
What was the national debt? What was the national debt when you inherited this economy?
The debt has gone up, Andrew, very significantly over a period of time when debt is essentially the accumulation of borrowing. We have brought borrowing down through a period of time which has been, first of all, difficult because of the performance of the world economy. We actually were on course to eliminate the deficit by the end.
We'll never know now, will
well,
we?
that is what the ABR are saying today. I mean, I think we probably
You are doing more than doubling the national debt. It was well under £1 trillion when you came to power. It could easily be £2 trillion by 2020 from a supposedly fiscally conservative government, which has inflicted huge austerity on this country, and yet you still have £2 trillion of debt. I mean, in other countries, people would be resigning with these figures.
But what is the argument, Andrew? Is the argument that we have done too much, or we have done too little? Because our critics often say, oh, you've cut too much and there's been too much austerity, and then complain about the fact
the argument is you haven't done what you said you would do.
Debt is too high. The reality is we have made a number of difficult decisions that has brought our deficit down by almost 2/3. There was a time, I remember, Andrew, in 2010 when people thought we were going to have to bring the IMF in to bail us out. But we...
Really?
Yes, I can remember people making that point.
I don't remember that.
I think Ken Clarke and George Osborne made that point at a press conference a few days before the general election in order to try to create that sense. So it's not quite that people
I can remember others as well.
Point.
But the point is that we faced a crisis in 2010. But we did restore credibility.
That was 6 years ago, and you're still borrowing more than ever.
Because of the scale of the challenge that we faced then, we have managed to maintain the confidence of the markets in the UK, which was not a given in 2010, I'm sure you would agree. And now we face new challenges. Now, the question is, how does a government respond? Should we go chasing after the 2019-20 surplus target? Our judgment is that would be the wrong thing to do. That would be too harsh on the economy, given the uncertainty that we now face. So I think this is an entirely pragmatic, sensible response to the circumstances that we're in, and that does involve borrowing a bit more for economic infrastructure. Well, £23 billion.
But you're borrowing £122 billion more. But anyway,
Laura. But Minister, isn't the point here that, as Andrew's suggesting, you've been failing your own tests? And the implication from today is you will go into the next general election unable to tell the general public when you will balance the books.
Well, we're unable to say when we will balance the books at this point. As the Chancellor made clear, the rule is that we will have the structural deficit below 2% by the end of this Parliament. At this point, what we're saying is that we will be in overall surplus at some point in the next Parliament, as soon as possible.
Our viewers should not expect that you will be going into the next general election, despite having built your reputation on saying you would clear the deficit, without being able to tell the public when you will have balanced the books.
Well, what we will be able to say by the time we get to 2020 is difficult to judge at the moment, because the whole point is we are entering into a period of uncertainty. The intention is to eliminate the overall deficit as soon as possible in the next Parliament. We may know more by the time we get to 2020, but we should have that flexibility at the moment.
Do you think in the end, by 2020, you should be able to give a much more definite signal than as early as possible to the public who voted for you on the basis that you were there to fix the public finance?
Well, the answer is
To be honest, we don't know at this stage because the very
But
point
you
is
could
we're
go
going
further.
in.
But you could go further, you
We're
think?
going into a period of uncertainty. I think it is right during a period of uncertainty. The pragmatic thing is to have that flexibility to respond to events. Where we will be by 2020, of course, we don't precisely know. So we would have to review.
What's
that
quite
as we
surprising, I
do
mean,
that.
so George Osborne said that a debt to GDP ratio of 90% was not sustainable. That is the figure you are going to hit next year. So presumably it isn't sustainable.
Well, I mean, one of the factors in there, as the Chancellor made clear, is that our debt numbers are made worse by some of the implications of what the Bank of England's operations have done, necessary operations. I'm not for a moment criticising that. I'm just making the point that has boosted that debt number. But, I mean, there is an important point that we do have to bring debt down. Now, of course, I would like us to be bringing debt down earlier and faster. But we have to respond to the circumstances that exist in the economy. And the circumstances that exist at the moment is a period of uncertainty whereby we need that flexibility to respond. And that's what the Chancellor is setting out. I think that's a pragmatic response to these circumstances.
Minister, there was one intriguing hint towards the end of the statement. The Chancellor suggested that the government might again look at its spending protections for some departments for the next Parliament. So, in other words, he was suggesting that you might lose the triple lock on pensions, you might get rid of the ring fence on NHS spending.
Well, we've made commitments for this Parliament, which the Chancellor reaffirmed. I mean, we always make these commitments Parliament by Parliament.
But that was a pretty clear hint that they've got a sell-by date.
Well, the point is that the commitments that we will make for the next Parliament will be commitments that we will make at the next spending review. They're not to be made now. And of course, at the point of the next spending review, we will have to look at how the economy is doing and what is affordable.
Well, let me ask you about the just about managing classes. I ask you because your government is the one that has put them at the centre of everything, the just about managing classes. Is it not clear from everything that is happening to the economy and what was announced today that at the end of this decade, the just about managing classes will be worse off than they are today?
Now, I don't think it is just about clear, because if you look at it, we've just had a period of time where growth in living standards has actually been pretty high. Last couple of years in particular, we've seen wages up, living standards growing very fast. It is the case, given that we're likely to see higher inflation, that there will be a squeeze over the next couple of years.
And the benefits are frozen.
But from 2018, we will see earnings rising again. That's what the OBR is predicting. But come back actually.
Let me get this point clear. Even if inflation doesn't go as badly as you think, it doesn't matter for them because their benefits are frozen. So whatever the inflation rate, they're worse off.
Well, I think what you'll find, I appreciate not had a chance to go through all the numbers yet, but I think what you'll find within the information that we have is that living standards will be higher by the end of this Parliament than they were at the beginning.
Well, let me put. I would suggest to you, Minister, that just about managing, the people who really fit into that are working families that need universal credit to top up because they're not being paid enough to be able to survive. So they get some extra welfare benefits and they're still just about managing. You wouldn't put it higher than that. Even when you take into account the rise in the national living wage that is planned, the income tax cuts, as some of them come out of income tax altogether, the free childcare, or the additional that's been talked about, working families will be on average £800 worse off by the end of the decade. £1,300 when you take in the impact of the benefit freeze.
Well, I'm not sure I recognise those numbers. One of the things that we have announced today has been the reduction in the taper rate of universal credit.
2 pence.
Well, you dismissed 2 pence. Give an example. A couple with the highest earner on 30,000, a couple with 2 children on the housing element of universal credit will benefit as a consequence of this 2 pence matter by £425 a year.
So I've taken, by the way, the 2%.
That's not
2% taper into account. The fact is, whichever way you cut it, working families on universal credit will be worse off by the end of this decade. Now, you could argue that may be one of the prices that has to be paid to stop borrowing getting way out of hand. But your government made the just about managing the centrepiece, the leitmotif of this government, and they're going to be worse off.
Well, as I say, I don't particularly recognise those numbers, but the point, I think it is important to say, coming back to our earlier conversation, is that we do have to get public finances under control. You've raised, perfectly fairly, criticism, well, you should be doing more, should be going faster. But, again, we have to strike a balance between fiscal credibility, reducing the deficit, but also ensuring that we have got an economy that can withstand
but then you cannot
troubles ahead and help the just about.
You cannot grandstand on the door to 10 Downing Street saying you are going to make the just about managing the centrepiece of your policies, and they end up worse off. We're talking about people who are not exactly well off in the first place.
But also, let me make this point to you, that one of the ways in which ultimately we raise living standards and we have an economy that can afford world-class public services is by ensuring that we have stronger productivity. That's why the big focus of what the Chancellor was saying today was about productivity, the investment in research and development, in transport infrastructure, in housing. These are all measures that can ensure that the UK economy can grow more, can prosper more, improve productivity, improve wages and salaries. And that's ultimately the way in which you help all of the people in this country. And that's very clearly what the Chancellor was arguing today.
Laura?
I was just merely going to say the problem that you have with that, however, is number 10, the Prime Minister has repeatedly set out a political aspiration, her political aspiration, that she will help people directly, that they will feel it in their pocket. Now, the Chancellor may believe that it's better to prioritise the long-term security of the economy and infrastructure, but right there, you have a mismatch and you have a clash between the rhetoric of the Prime Minister and the reality of what this statement has put forward.
No, again, I don't accept that. I think when you look at what we have just announced in terms of the universal credit taper, which is not a small policy, if you look at what we've done with the fuel duty, if you look at one of the things we've done in terms of housing, the additional £1.4 billion for affordable housing, those are all measures that are going to help ordinary working class families in a period of uncertainty and difficulty, which we've discussed the reasons behind that a little bit earlier. So again, it's a balance that has to be struck. The long-term credibility of our public finances, the long-term growth of the economy through better infrastructure, etc., and also helping the British public through potentially a difficult year or two, as I say, and I think that's a balance that the Chancellor struck very well today.
Sounds like, meanwhile, the just about managing are going to have to just continue just about managing. David Gauke, thank you for rushing over from the Commons Chamber to be with us. I know this is a busy day for you as well as the Chancellor. Let's go now to Joko in Portsmouth.
Yes, Andrew, I'm sheltering underneath a giant catamaran here at the home of where they build these kinds of racing boats at Land Rover BAR, as you say, on the waterfront in Portsmouth. One of the points, actually, that would have been very relevant for this part of the UK was when the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, said that he felt that too much economic growth had been focused on London and the South East at the expense of cities like Portsmouth. Well, who better to discuss that point with than Donna Jones, who is the Conservative leader of Portsmouth City Council. How big is that gap between cities like Portsmouth in terms of economic prosperity and London and the South East?
Well, here in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, we have a £3 billion productivity gap with the remainder of the southeast of England, and even greater into the tens of billions if you compared us to London. So I do welcome some of the announcements today, because whilst that money is very needed in the north of the country to make the economy grow, we do also need some infrastructure in the southeast too.
Have you been jealous of the Northern Powerhouse, as it's been termed by the previous Chancellor? Could something like that be done here?
Yes, we've been working on a Solent combined authority, very much like the Northern Powerhouse. And I think the money that comes through from the government to enable local authorities such as ours to build motorways and that key infrastructure is absolutely vital.
How badly do you need new roads, new infrastructure? The Chancellor did talk about more investment to the tune of £2 billion. Doesn't sound like that much if it's got to be spread around the whole of the UK.
Yes, I mean, I think we have to realise that we are still in an austerity programme. We do still have a budget deficit nationally that must be addressed. However, I do welcome the announcement. £3.7 billion has been announced today for infrastructure to aid housing delivery and roads. £2.3 billion of that for roads specifically. We haven't had any investment in rail infrastructure here since the 60s, and we need to rebuild part of the motorway here in Portsmouth. So to deliver the 18,000 homes that we need to build in the next 20 years, we desperately need some more infrastructure in roads and rail.
Because otherwise you're not going to be able to deliver those homes?
Makes it very difficult to, yes.
Right, and what about affordable housing? I mean, the figure was 40,000 affordable homes that money is going to be invested into a fund. But again, this is much, much less than is actually needed across the country.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good start, and I do welcome the fact that the Chancellor has taken a pragmatic approach to budget neutrality. Today making the announcement that we won't reach a budget neutral position for the UK economy by 2020, but it will be achieved at some point in the forthcoming Parliament from 2020 onwards. I think that's realistic. I've looked at the OBR forecast for the next 5 years, and I think that on the whole, today was a very sensible budget. Yes, we need more money in growth for infrastructure, but I do believe that today's budget, and the key word for me is around build. I think they want to build more homes, build more roads, and create, as we heard, over 500,000 new jobs.
Right, you said that actually you welcome the sort of loosening, the flexibility in terms of balancing the books. It's not going to be done in this Parliament. It may be done soon into the next Parliament. But what does that mean about the state of the public finances, which will affect you as a council?
Well, there have been some upsides and some downsides today. I welcome very much the increase in the personal allowance for taxpayers, taking over 2 million people out of tax completely with that increase to £11,500 by April 17, putting more money back into the pockets of individuals. On the downside, for me as a council, the increase in the national living wage to £7.50 will have an effect. We do have people through care contracts that we award looking after elderly people who will be paid around the living wage, and therefore that will have a slight effect on our balance sheet.
Yes, because the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, said there was nothing from his perspective boosting social care, and therefore there'd be more pressure on the NHS.
We were anticipating an increase in the adult social care precept today from 2% up slightly. I think that announcement may still come in subsequent days. Wasn't included today in the Chancellor's budget, but they're the sorts of things that we as care providers, councils will be really looking very closely at the details of some of those implications from today's autumn statement.
Donna Jones, thank you very much. And Donna mentioned actually the families who will just be managing, those who are only just about managing to pay their bills, pay their rent, perhaps pay their mortgages. So let's talk to our personal finance expert, Ruth Alexander, about some of the issues that might have affected them. Was there much in this budget for those people who are, to use that phrase, just about managing?
Well, there was a little bit, but I don't think anybody's going to see their lives massively transformed by what's been announced. You were just talking then about the personal allowance increasing. So that's something that's been announced before. It's basically the point at which you have to pay tax. It's going to increase to £12,500. It's £11,000 at the moment. So £12,500 by the end of the Parliament. So 2020, 2021. So it'll take some people out of tax altogether and help others. Also, the higher rate tax threshold will go to £50,000 by the end of the Parliament. Something that will have caught some people's attention if they're savers, if they have anything at all left over at the end of the month. At the moment, you just really can't get any kind of decent interest rate on your savings. It's just so hard. But the government said they're going to have a new market-leading savings bond. This will come through NS&I. Most of the detail will be at the budget, but they say they expect it'll have an interest rate of 2.2%. It's not huge amounts,
no, but it's better
more
than
than you can
current
get at the moment.
Yeah.
That's right. There'll be a term of 3 years and you'll be able to save up to £3,000. The fact that fuel duty will be frozen for the 7th year in a row, I think that will be good news to anyone who was worried that it could get a bit higher. I had an email from Katie. She asks, will wages for 16 to 17-year-olds increase? Yes, but I'm not sure this is the news she was hoping for. I'm afraid by just 5 pence an hour.
So that's not going to transform her chances,
no,
yes?
It's not. The reason she was asking that is because there's been a lot of talk, and in fact it was confirmed, that the national living wage is going to go up. That's for people who are aged 25 and over. That's going from £7.20 to £7.50 from April. So, you know, that again, that sounds good, except earlier in the year it was expected that it would go up a little bit more than that. So that's not great. Daniel and Darren have both asked this ban on letting agents' fees, when this will come in. All we know that it's going to be as soon as possible. Darren is renegotiating a contract with his letting agent at the moment. They want to charge him a fee for that. He says, you know, does this ban mean I won't have to? Probably he still will.
So when do you think we'll find out exactly when that'll come in?
I don't know, as soon as possible, maybe in the next month or so.
All right, Ruth Alexander, thank you very much. And of course, the big news that Philip Hammond announced was that this will be the last ever autumn statement. Back to you, Andrew.
We know, Joko, we're in mourning here for it, but we're buoyed up by the idea that there might be a spring. There will be a spring statement instead. And viewers in Scotland leave us now for more on the impact of the autumn statement north of the border. If you're just joining us, perhaps wondering what has happened in the autumn statement, let's give you a recap from the autumn statement, the first major financial statement by the new Chancellor, Philip Hammond. Start with the economic forecasts. The government is predicting that debt, our total national accumulated debt, will reach 90% of our overall wealth, our GDP, by 2017-18. Borrowing is going to increase. The idea of a budget surplus is not going to be reached by the end of this decade. Indeed, there's no word as to when it will be reached now. And growth forecasts are falling to 1.4% next year. They get a little bit better the year after that and then rise again. So next year, it will see the OBR, a lot of pressure on the OBR to see if that growth forecast for next year is right, because a lot has followed from it. There are a number of other main measures that the Chancellor announced. The national living wage is going to rise to £7.50 per hour by April. That was in the pipeline, so no surprise there. Speaking of pipelines, fuel duty rise has been cancelled. I think that's the 7th year in a row the Chancellor has cancelled the automatic rise in fuel duty. Insurance premium tax, however, is going to increase from 10 to 12% from June 2017. That's one of those taxes that chancellors of all political persuasions think they can nudge up without anybody noticing too much, till, of course, the insurance bill arrives. And the Chancellor announced £23 billion for a new national productivity investment fund, but that is spread over 5 years. But by the end of 5 years, there will be several billion more going into productivity investment. A few other measures, excuse me, still getting through this with the voice. Universal credit taper is reduced, spoke too soon, from 65 to 63 pence for every pound earned. It's a marginal adjustment for those that lose benefits as they earn more. Another 1.4 billion to help 40,000 new homes only in England, but that again is a problem too, because that's spread over a number of years. Northern Ireland got another 250 million, Wales 400, Scotland 800 million. And as we said earlier, the autumn statement is being abolished, which for people like me is a very sad day indeed, and Laura and Kamal as well. But we've got a spring statement instead, so whoopee to that. Let's go back to Joanna Gosling. She's on College Green. Joanna.
Whoopee to that, yes, thank you, Andrew. Well, with me now, Tim Farron, the Lib Dem MP, and Mark Reckless for UKIP. How do you square what you've heard today? Because we heard from the Chancellor talking about the underlying strength and resilience of the UK economy. He's also been talking about eye-watering levels of debt, and the figure that's being put on that is an extra £122 billion of cumulative additional borrowing. How would you assess, therefore, the state of the nation's finances and what you've heard?
Well, I think we've just seen the epitaph on the fact that over the last 5 months, all of the good work we did on financial stability in the coalition has been undone. The Chancellor will say he had no alternative, but the figure actually in terms of the gap, the OBR's figure, is 220 billion. We found out what Brexit means. Brexit means increase in unemployment, as the OBR suggests. It means lower growth, it means lower living standards, and it means spiralling debt. And if we believe that this is a disaster that Britain should avoid, particularly the hard Brexit that absolutely nobody voted for, then Britain certainly deserves better than the white flag that the Labour Party waved in front of Philip Hammond this afternoon.
Mark Reckless, the price of Brexit?
Well, I'd say it's the epitaph for the 3 million jobs lie. People like Tim Farron were telling us we left the EU, 3 million jobs could be at risk, and we see the forecast officially for unemployment in 2020 after we've left the EU is just 860,000.
But what about those debt figures? £122 billion of additional borrowing, GDP not doing as well as had been anticipated, and overall the level of debt just not going down as
the growth forecast is reasonably good, but the government is borrowing too much. They sort of talk a tough game on austerity, but their words are not matched with deeds.
So what would you say that?
Well, what we'd like to say is we'd accelerate leaving the European Union. Every month we're in, it's another £1 billion we're paying. I'm pleased to see the official forecast has a cliff edge fall in our contributions. No more contributions to the EU after December 2018, according to this statement. We'd also like to make savings on overseas aid to focus on the humanitarian disaster relief, but save 10 billion a year. We'd scrap HS2. We'd look again at the green subsidies, and we need to get the public finances in order.
So what we've discovered in terms of the black hole within the Chancellor's budget, so £220 billion over this term, over this Parliament, that massively reduces the income tax take, the tax take across the board. And what it means, because we have at the same time, since the 23rd of June, it almost seems that every single day has been a good day to very bad news. And the worst possible news has been within our National Health and Social Care Service. There wasn't a penny extra given towards the NHS today, when it could and should have been. And the problem is that whilst we head towards a hard Brexit that absolutely nobody voted for, an exit from the single market that was not on the ballot paper, then what you're seeing is less income into the exchequer. It means less money into our health service and less money into our schools. That can be fixed.
The savings that Mark Reckless talks about as a result of getting out of the EU?
Well, the one thing that, I'm in many ways I admire Mark for carrying on repeating what was on the side of that bus, £350 million a week. Well, I'm
377 million. It's been revised up according to these figures.
It's a delight to hear someone standing by it. You are the only person on the planet who still believes that. And the reality is, in this post-truth world, we've had some truth today. We've seen that the gap between what we could have had and what we will have is £250 billion over this Parliament. Can you imagine the number of nurses, doctors, social workers, teachers, police officers and soldiers we could be paying for if this government hadn't headed for a hard Brexit that nobody voted for?
Of what would happen to the economy in the immediate aftermath have not happened, have they?
Not the predictions I made.
But talking about a dramatic increase in unemployment, it's going the other way.
So we've seen, again, £220 billion hole in the public finances, and we see what that will lead to. My job, the worst thing in the world is to be a person in opposition wanting things to go badly to prove your case. I don't want that. I want Britain to be strong. That's why I actually think that Philip Hammond's announcements on infrastructure, limited and too late though many of them are actually encouraging. At a time of low interest rates, of course we should be spending and doing the things we've been telling them to do for the last 18 months. The problem is that because of making a choice of hard Brexit that nobody voted for, Philip Hammond has put himself in a position where that good work that he may be doing on infrastructure investment will be swamped and dwarfed by the black hole that he is creating.
It feels, Mark Reckless, like we are in a period of complete uncertainty and unpredictability in terms of these are all predictions that we're hearing today, obviously, and predictions aren't always right. We don't really know what the impact will be once Britain leaves the EU.
Official predictions certainly are not always right. We had the Treasury just 6 months ago telling us if we voted to leave, unemployment would already be up to 1.2 million, 1.3 million next year. Now we hear from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility that it will be just 760,000. We do, I think, get a bit more certainty, at least in terms of an official forecast of what's going to happen with leaving the EU. Contributions to the EU budget stop in December 2018, and there are no tariffs going forward with the European Union. So I think that's good news in terms of official position, and I think business can plan on the basis there won't be tariffs with the EU. We'll have savings coming online, and actually the outlook is pretty good.
I mean, first of all, that's a wonderful piece of spin. Can I tell you that the reality, the one figure that I think we can't ignore, that both of us probably agree on because it's there and obvious, is that there are 500 million consumers in the European Union, in the single market, the largest, most prosperous market on planet Earth, and a major reason for that enormous black hole that is, if it can affect every public service and every family in this country, is because at the moment Britain is heading outside of that single market. To talk about access to the single market is nonsense. North Korea has got access to the single market. Membership of the single market will be the difference between this country growing and prospering and us floundering, and we mustn't do the latter.
What we want is tariff-free access to the single market, is I think probably what we would agree is desirable.
Why would that happen without freedom of movement?
Exactly.
Well, I'm just saying that according to the official forecasts, it will, and they're not expecting us to be bringing in all this revenue from tariffs, which will be far, far more for us if we applied tariffs to the European Union than it would be for them, and it's not in their interest to apply tariffs. I don't think that's going to happen. There will be restrictions on freedom of movement and no more contributions to the budget.
What we've heard today, and obviously the fact that the borrowing figures are where they are, have the last years of austerity been a complete waste of time, because people out there will think, I have been hit so hard in the pocket and the nation's finances are still in this state.
I mean, the reality is that for 5 years, the Liberal Democrats, not making ourselves massively popular in the process, fought to make sure that there was fairness whilst we put the lid on excessive spending to get the finances in order. And the last 5 months have completely undone that. The Tories' reputation for fiscal responsibility is completely out the window as a consequence. So yes, that is depressing, but it's more depressing for the people around the country who will suffer the consequences of that. And yes, austerity has been felt. It's nothing compared to what may come if we don't maintain membership of the single market, softening Brexit if at all possible, and best of all, when we see the deal we're going to get, give the British people a say on that, those final terms.
The Chancellor says that he can afford to do what he's doing because of the reputation that has been built up with austerity and the management of the economy. He's putting out these new fiscal rules. What do you think of those?
Well, we've been asking for him to do that some time, and those are the things we encouraged when we were in government.
People believe fiscal rules anymore?
Well, probably not. The problem is that the good stuff that is in this autumn statement, and there is some, which is essentially the investment in our infrastructure, it's far too small. It's dwarfed by what is actually needed, but it's also massively dwarfed by the enormous black hole and the damage done by the impending hard Brexit that absolutely nobody voted for.
I agree with Tim that the infrastructure spend is too small, and let's get on with shovel-ready projects, sort of local roads, things that can be done. We'd like to improve the Manchester-Liverpool line. We'd like to scrap the tolls on the crossings of the Severn, the Humber, the Mersey Tunnel and the Dartford crossing, and I think we can pay for that by cutting HS2, which is a huge bondiggle far in the future, reduce overseas aid, make some savings and push ahead with a positive economic future.
Thank you very much, Mark Reckless. Tim Farron, thank you very much. Back to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Joanna. Laura, what are the politics of this? I mean, how will this go down with the Tory backbenchers?
I think in a funny way, they might actually have some irritation at both sides of the party, both on the sort of Eurosceptic further to the right end and also those sort of softer, more liberal kinds of Conservatives. On that side, first of all, because the sort of tweaking of the cuts to universal credit don't really make very much difference. And there has been a lot of strong feeling on the Tory benches about making that change in order to make that message about helping people who are having a hard time really ring true. Then at the other end, look, there's some people who really believe that the Tories should have gone further and harder in cutting the first time round, and the idea of pushing out paying down the deficit even further is also not going to be very popular. More broadly, though, look, I think we're in a period where the Tory backbenches are maybe a bit grumpy around the edges, but not massively restive. Right. So broadly, I don't think there's going to be sort of uprisings and public fury to any great extent about today.
Now, you've been digging in and discovered an interesting figure.
Indeed. Buried in one of the documents is a figure for how much it might cost Whitehall to go through the process of us leaving the European Union. There has been a lot of concern in recent days about how many civil servants we'll need. Is Whitehall really up to it? And the statement reveals they expect £412 million to be the cost just in Whitehall of getting through our departure from the EU. So nothing to do with the potential consequences for the economy, but actually what it will cost central government to get this done. Now, at a time when they're having to look for savings all over the place, £500 million just on admin, that's quite a big cheque.
It's a lot of money. Kamal, to what extent, you're a new Chancellor. So maybe you want to kind of benchmark and get the worst out first.
That's absolutely right.
And then everything gets better. Should we look at it in this way?
I think so. He's like a new chief executive or a new chief financial officer, I think, as you described him, Laura, earlier. You come in, you make sure that your bottom line is, you're not going to manipulate it, but is as gloomy as possible, because then things can look better. Now, I don't think Philip Hammond will be particularly maybe looking to the headlines tomorrow or tonight, or the headlines even next week or next month or next year. But just don't forget, 2020 and a general election. We've just interviewed or chatted with David Gauke, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. He did not rule out actually making that budget balance target much more distinct by the time of 2020. They have a vague notion about it now, but by the election they might be much more confident about where those economic numbers are going. The big points, I think, for the government here are that they can't let cuts and people on benefits take even more of the pain. I think even George Osborne was getting to the point at which the Conservative Party were clear in voting down many of his tax credit changes, that you couldn't go further.
He had to retreat,
The point is, Philip Hammond needs to be a chancellor who does what very few chancellors have managed to do over the decades: improve our economic performance, improve productivity. The other thing as well, not just about just managing families, but people getting on the housing ladder. They have announced a group of policies around house building, which they hope will kickstart the housing market. Again, these are incredibly slow, long-term, deeply entrenched problems that actually Philip Hammond, I think, knows in his gut will be the test of his chancellorship, rather than the state, bad as they are today, of the public finance.
I seem to remember we've had quite a few measures to kickstart housing in recent years, and autumn statements and so on. Let's get more political reaction. Let's go to the SNPs. Stuart Hosey, he's in central lobby in the Commons. Mr. Hosey, welcome. Another £800 million for Scotland. You must be over the moon.
Well, every little helps, but given we've had 10% revenue cuts over the piece, and I think it's a 15 or 16% capital cut over the piece. If he unwinds some of those cuts, of course that's helpful. But the big story in today was the way in which the 2010 promise to be fulfilled in 2015 numbers on deficit, on debt, on borrowing will either not be met until the end of this Parliament. In the case of the debt figure, not at all. It really does rather confirm what we've been saying for some time. This decade of austerity has been an unmitigated disaster if the intention was to turn those numbers around.
Indeed, the deficit figures don't look so great for the government at the moment. On the other hand, Scotland's deficit's about 10% of GDP, so you aren't really in a position to lecture the Chancellor, are you?
Well, of course, most of Scotland's economy is run from London. Even with the new tranche of devolution, as you know, it's a limited set of income tax powers, nothing on corporation tax powers. Even 15% of welfare, while it's useful, is not the whole kit and caboodle, and far from it. So the deficit we have is in large measure driven by economic policy here, and I'm delighted, even though it was limited, the Chancellor has changed tack to at least some extent.
You must have seen some of this money coming. Have you given any thought as to how you'll spend it?
No, I mean, there was lots of rumours, as you know, over the past few weeks about what he might do in terms of capital, what he might do in terms of releasing the purse strings, or in some cases actually not releasing the purse strings. There have been lots of mixed messages. So the Scottish Government will determine over the next few weeks before the Scottish Government budget what it does with the money and when they're going to get it. I'm in no position to spend Scottish Government finances.
No, I understand that, but you've got some new welfare powers now, and you've been highly critical of the government's approach to disabled claimants. Would you start to top up these amounts yourself in Scotland?
Again, that's a set of measures which will be announced in the budget, precisely how those powers are used and what level of mitigation might be possible in certain circumstances. But again, I wouldn't want to prejudge a budget statement that has not yet been made in Holyrood. That would be completely wrong, Andrew.
I understand that. Mr. Hosey, Laura?
Stuart Hosey, do you think some of your supporters would be blamed if they maybe felt a bit disappointed that you're not quite rushing ahead to use the new powers that you have? You seem to be rather taking your time over actually taking them up, having campaigned so aggressively for them.
Well, no, I mean, as the First Minister has said, we will take the powers when they're offered, we'll use them when we're able to use them. A welfare system has to be put in place in order to deliver, a social security system that's fit for purpose. But given we've just had a UK autumn statement, it might be slightly better to remind ourselves that what he did today in terms of social security, it was change the taper, the amount of money people can keep before they start losing their benefit, by 2 pence in the pound. On a minimum wage job, that's about 14 pence an hour. It's not exactly a king's ransom, and it's unlikely to turn lives around.
What about the city deal? Stirling is now getting a city deal. I understand that every city in Scotland will now have a city deal.
Well, we've been calling for this. The plans have been laid. I spoke to the Tay Cities deal team about a month ago. Work is well underway to ensure that what's done with that in terms of capital, in terms of outcome, in terms of jobs, is fully packaged, and it's a really good sellable deal. So the Chancellor announced the Tay City deal today. We'll have to make sure that's delivered in full and on time, and I'm sure that Dundee, Perth, Angus and North East Fife will benefit greatly from it. But can I say the teams on the ground in the local authorities who've pulled these deals together have done an extraordinary job, and I think all congratulations should go to them.
Sure, Rosie, thanks for joining us and giving us your reaction to the autumn statement. Let's get more reaction from our business editor, because the cities have been very important this autumn statement, given the post-Brexit situation. So let's go back to Simon Jack.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Yes, we've been looking at markets and how they've been reacting to what they've heard. Of course, the big takeaway, I think, today is what the public finances are going to look like. We've got 90% debt as a percentage of GDP in 2017-18. That's the highest it's been for 50 years. That's what the OBR projected today. Now, this chart here tells us what the government has to pay to borrow money over 10 years, and it's gone from 1.36% this morning to 1.46%. So it's not an enormous move, but in fixed income terms, in bond terms, that's quite a big move. We also learnt that by the end of the period we'll be very close to a total debt bill of £2 trillion. Well, let's get the thoughts of a couple of people to see what they took away from the autumn statement today. Christian May, the editor of City AM, which is a newspaper for the city here, and Carolyn Fairbairn, Director General of the CBI, the Employers Group. First of all, what jumped out at you from today's statement, Christian?
Thinking of our front page tomorrow, I think it has to be the underlying economic conditions that the Chancellor is now going to have to operate within. It seems to be a case now of increased debt, borrowing will be back, almost Keynesian some levels of huge pledges of investment in certain sectors, certain industries, lower growth, lower tax receipts and higher borrowing. So within that, it's perhaps not surprising that there weren't huge numbers of rabbits out of the hat in terms of specific policies, although there were a few, including some pretty cheeky tax rises. For example, we've had some rather angry insurance company bosses on the phone already about the particular tax rise from 10 to 12% in insurance premiums. So some tinkering around that, but pretty gloomy underlying economic conditions.
And also he said that obviously the target to eliminate the deficit by 2019 to 2020, that went out of the window some time ago. That was very unrealistic. The new target today, to try and balance the books sometime in the next Parliament or as soon as possible. Is that too vague?
Well, Osborne had his fiscal rules and failed to meet any of those. So Hammond's created several more, and we'll see if he manages to perform within those parameters. But the debt peak up to 90% of GDP is extraordinary. Hammond described it as eye-watering just over the weekend, and he's certainly going to deliver on that pledge. It is a pretty eye-watering situation. Those are the conditions he'll have to operate in.
It's getting more eye-watering. I think we can all agree on that. Carolyn Fairbairn, a big emphasis on the spending that he did announce today, big emphasis on infrastructure, productivity. What did you make of it?
Yes, I mean, no big rabbit out of hat, but a welcome down payment on the future productivity of the economy. So £23 billion fund focusing on particularly local infrastructure. I think that was something new. Local pinch points, local roads that will help unlock regional growth. £2 billion announced on Monday, part of that in R&D, not just development, not just research, but also the development of new ideas here in the UK. And of course, broadband, which has become something that businesses talk a lot about in terms of productivity.
Also, he said that it's sometimes unlocking the housing piece of this is difficult because of local infrastructure. You can't build there. We don't have the roads. We don't have the infrastructure to support new building. So there was a renewed focus on that. Did you hear enough there?
Yes, we were very pleased to see that, because there was this connection between housing and transport and the commitment to building new homes, but actually all types of different homes. And I think some of the emphasis that there's been on ownership has been replaced replaced by kind of recognition that there needs to be a range of different kinds of housing. So that was very good news.
I was struck by a couple of things I didn't hear. I didn't hear, keeping the capital allowances piece very higher for businesses, which is the tax-free amount they can invest in new plant, new machinery, new processes. He could have gone further?
Well, I think one of the things that we are struck by is, given we've got the downgrade for next year, which very close to the CBI forecast of 1.3%, that you are facing uncertainty, businesses are facing higher prices coming through, and there wasn't anything in there for the short-term investment picture. And so we do think that the Chancellor should keep a watching brief on that as these price rises and pressures come through in the early new year.
And no further cut to corporation tax. There was a little bit of chat that if we do want the lowest corporation tax in the world, and Mr. Trump in America does cut it to 15%, we could go lower even than the 17, which is the aspiration through this Parliament, to 15. Is it your experience that actually it's not corporation tax which is uppermost in most businesses' mind?
I have to say it is our experience. I think businesses will really welcome the fact that the business roadmap has been confirmed and the 17% has been confirmed. But we're not hearing huge calls for it to go lower. We are hearing for some of the investment allowances and some of these incentives to invest in the infrastructure challenges to be put higher up on the list than corporation tax.
And one other thing I heard Christian was saying, the triple lock is safe till 2020, but then we'll think again.
He claims that he might have to think again, or rather he hinted that the government will think again. But then given the enormous fiscal consolidation which they've penciled in, again...
That's code for cuts.
Cuts. Down the line, 2019, 2020. If they're seriously suggesting they're going to do that at the same time as telling pensioners we're coming for your perks, then I'm not sure anyone in government wants to go into an election, even if they're facing Jeremy Corbyn, with those kind of pledges. So we'll have to wait and see.
OK, Christian May from City AM and Carolyn Fairburn, Director General of the CBI. As I say, government borrowing costs getting a little more expensive today as we look into a bleaker fiscal picture going forward. Pound pretty steady. The city was braced for pretty gloomy economic forecasts, and that's exactly what they got.
Thank you, Simon. In the city there, let's get more from Labour on this autumn statement. We're joined by the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Rebecca Long-Bailey. Welcome to the programme. Now, we carried John McDonnell's critique of the autumn statement in full. So let me ask you a bit about Labour's position. Do you want to balance the books?
Certainly, and we would have liked to have seen more certainty from the Chancellor today. He's obviously abandoned George Osborne's surplus rule, which we thought was inachievable, but he hasn't really given us a date in terms of bringing the deficit down.
But when would you balance the books?
Well, we've got a fiscal credibility rule where we'd bring it down on a 5-year rolling period, but we'd also separate. The way George Osborne used to couple capital expenditure with public spending. We would separate that, so you would never have to borrow in terms of public spending. That would come out of your tax receipts, and that's responsible to do that. In terms of your capital expenditure, this would be kept separately so that you could borrow to invest in the way that Philip Hammond has suggested today. And at the same time, you would bring the deficit down.
But you are promising to spend a lot more on current spending. You've called for the reversal of the universal credit cuts. That's at least $3 billion. You want much more money for the NHS and for social care. That's a multi-billion current spending as well. There's a number of other areas in welfare that you want to spend more or restore the cuts that have been made. So I don't understand, given you're going to add all that to current spending, when you would balance even that bit of the budget.
Well, we wouldn't have made the same decisions that this government has made. We wouldn't have cut capital gain tax, we wouldn't have slashed inheritance tax for the most wealthy in society, and then expected the most vulnerable in society to shoulder the burden like they are having to do so through universal credit and also the cuts to employment support allowance. In terms of raising further revenue through taxes, we've got a tax avoidance transparency programme that we would enforce to give more legal teeth. Well, I mean, £5 billion is what the government intends to recoup, but I mean, pundits outside of government estimate anything between 70 to 135 billion going out of the country in terms of tax avoidance. But what we're concerned about...
How much would you hope to get?
What we're concerned about, well, we'd have to examine that. The problem that we've got at the moment is that the government is scaling back on the resources it has within HMRC. It's cutting the number of offices it's got. It's cutting the number of employees in each department. So in order to try and get an accurate vision of how much money we're actually losing per year, the government doesn't even have those resources itself. So we would make sure that HMRC was adequately resourced. Now, the third point in terms of increasing your tax revenue is ensuring that we get our productivity levels up. The OBR report today,
had horrific productivity predictions yet again. The Chancellor referred to in his speech the fact that he appreciated that there was a productivity problem. So something isn't going well for this government. They're not investing in industry, they're not investing in infrastructure, and they're not creating the high-paid, high-skilled jobs of the future that would result in future tax returns for the government.
Why do you want to balance the books?
Because it's fiscally responsible to do so. You can't expect to pluck money from the money tree. It's responsible for the government to invest in the future, but at the same time, you should never have to borrow for your public spending. That should come through your tax.
Well, what other government does it?
Pardon?
What other government does balance the books around the Western world?
Well, there are a number of fiscal positions taken by other governments around the world. It's difficult to pinpoint particular governments who have a 0% deficit. I think it's
Germany is one.
Well, they've had a long-term industrial strategy, and I think
as I look at Italy, I look at Italy, France, Spain, the United States. They're not planning to balance the books. So I wondered why Labour thought it was so important.
No, it's fiscally responsible to balance the books, but you can't balance the books at the expense of not investing in your future and your future infrastructure, because you have to balance the books at the same time of ensuring future productivity and future tax receipts.
What would you do to raise productivity?
Well, we'd invest in infrastructure on a larger scale than the Chancellor's put forward today. What he said today is certainly welcome. Some of it's a repeat of what his predecessor had put forward.
That's a long term. It takes a long time for infrastructure investment, A, to happen, and B, to have an impact on productivity.
No, I think there's...
So what would you do to raise it in the first couple of years?
There's a large number, Andrew, of shovel-ready projects in the infrastructure pipeline, and we didn't hear mention of many of those
ones are
today.
they?
Well, I mean, I've got a massively long list that I can email across
give me
to
one.
you. Well, you know, we've got HS2 that doesn't seem to be progressing very fast. There's electrification of the Midlands main line, which has been halted time and time again. Well, we've got a vast number of them, and they're available on the government website.
But give me a shovel-ready one.
Take a look at them.
I understand the website's full of infrastructure projects, and I perfectly take Labour's point that a lot of them haven't been implemented. But give me an infrastructure project that is shovel-ready.
Well, Swansea Tidal Lagoon is something that the government has been pushing for.
That would take years to plan. That hasn't even got planning permission yet.
Well, I think if you look on the government website, Andrew, you can see a long list of the shovel-ready projects if you're so interested to do so.
No, what I see on the point is this.
There are a list
what I see on the government website.
For the government
what I see on the government
today.
website is a long list of infrastructure projects. What I don't see is shovel-ready. I'll give you an example, get you to react. HS2 was approved 8 years ago, so it was hardly shovel-ready. In fact, the diggers turned up last week to begin part of the building in Bucks. They didn't have the right local authority permits. They'll be sent away, and they won't be allowed back to sometime in the new year. It's not shovel-ready.
I appreciate there are a number of local issues on particular projects, and those need to be addressed as quickly as possible. But there are a number of projects that, if the Chancellor did a bit of further investigation on, he would find that they were shovel-ready. And again, if you look at the government website, there is a long list of those available.
You were the one that
but I do
said
appreciate that, as you said, there are some that are affected by local considerations. But the point is that the Chancellor hasn't even touched the sides in what we need to secure further productivity increases in this country. And it's not just talking about shovel-ready projects, it's about investing in skills and education. We've seen horrific cuts to education over the last few years. We are not skilling our workforce up for the future. We are not delivering the long-term prosperity this country needs.
Do you buy the OBR's verdict that the government will end up borrowing a lot more money because of the impact of Brexit? I mean, does Labour accept that analysis?
I think we're in extremely uncertain times, and we've seen quite a lot of chaos from the government so far. I mean, in terms of our red lines, we want tariff-free access at the very least to the single market, and I think that's what business is calling for as well. And we've seen nothing to suggest that that will be pushed for by this government going forward. And in terms of borrowing, I couldn't hazard a guess at the amounts of money that the government would have to borrow in terms of a worsening Brexit situation.
Well, the OBR, in fact, is very clear. I mean, they've said there'll be £58 billion extra of borrowing that they put down to the impacts of Brexit. And in a sense, that is the biggest fact that the OBR or forecast that they put forward today. But do you, as a party, do you accept that the impacts of the economy
of our decision will be that great. Do you accept that analysis?
Well, I think it's a forecast, and I think they've caveated that in the report by stating that it simply is a forecast dependent on the government's ongoing negotiations. But what I would say is that the government can put in place initiatives now to try and alleviate any need to do that, and that would be demanding tariff-free access to the single market for a start. So we just want some certainty going forward, and we know we've got certainty on corporation tax, and as the CBI mentioned in your report earlier, we just want to see more certainty going forward in terms of what our terms for exiting the EU are going to be. At the very least, some red lines for business.
I'm just wondering if I could ask a bit about the public finances. Given that you, if you win in 2020, would be taking over a government where the debt to GDP ratio would be flirting with 90%, do you still think at that point the markets, the investors in our debt, would support the Labour Party borrowing more money?
Well, I think it was Mark Carney that made a statement not so long ago, and he said we rely on our friends overseas, the kindness of strangers, I think he said. And the longer our situation is uncertain, the longer that kindness erodes away.
No, but what I'm wondering about is, given the downgrading of the public finances by the Office for Budget Responsibility today, do you still stick to the notion that the markets would still support a Labour government borrowing more money, given that in 2020 the public finances are going to be in far worse a state than you thought you were going to inherit if you win the election in 2020?
Well, we really hope that they're not, and we need to see some business red lines.
No, but do you think you can borrow more? I just wonder if you think it's sustainable.
I think you need to borrow to invest in infrastructure.
So you think you could borrow more, even though debt to GDP ratio is at 90%?
No, you'd have to assess the public finances at the time, but you couldn't cut off your arms. You'd have to make sure that you were securing future productivity for the country. But as I said, without a crystal ball, I couldn't make an assessment of the fiscal situation at the time we exited the EU, but I really, really do implore the Chancellor to start pushing for tariff-free access to the single market, because it's imperative. And another point that he should be pushing as well is for the financial passport.
But even though we've seen borrowing costs for the government today are slowly rising, there's inflation risk in particular, you still think that the markets would support you borrowing more on top of what the OBR is saying already this government will be borrowing?
Well, as I said, we'd have to assess the fiscal situation at the time. I mean, I wouldn't want us to be in a worsening financial situation, and we will be if this government doesn't take strong action in terms of Brexit. But we would have to assess the financial situation at the time to specify the amounts that we would borrow. And you're right in what you say, the amount of debt that we're in would affect that.
Can I just
make wishy-washy spending
check
decisions.
with you? You want the government to take to outline its red lines on Brexit. It's perfectly understandable position to be. That's the job of the opposition to do that. What's your red line? Would you leave membership of the single market?
We wouldn't want to leave membership of the single market, but at the very least we want tariff-free access, and we want the government to start
You said you wouldn't
that.
leave membership of the single market.
We wouldn't like to leave membership of the single market.
So
whether that's on the cards or not remains to be seen. But we want at least a guarantee from the government that they'll maintain some degree of access
I understand.
to the market for us.
That's a question for the government. I understand that. What I'm asking now is Labour's position, because who knows, these matters may be unresolved. So you have said that you would want to remain a member of the single market.
No, we've said our bare minimum is tariff-free access to the single market. That's our bare minimum.
Right,
Obviously,
but would you prefer to remain as a member?
Well, I mean, whether that's actually achievable or not is another matter.
What about the customs union?
Yes, we think it's imperative to remain a member of the customs
So you would
union
accept that by doing that, this country couldn't make its own free trade deals?
Well, I mean, all things are negotiable, Andrew, as you know.
No, they're not in the customs union.
Well, I think we would demand to remain the part of the customs union because it would have such a detrimental impact.
Right, but there's no member of the customs union makes its own free trade deals. So you would accept that we could not then do free trade deals with Canada, America, Australia, India, if Labour's policy of remaining on the customs union
Well,
stays.
just because it hasn't happened so far doesn't mean that it might not be open to negotiations in the future, Andrew. I mean, we're in very politically uncertain times at the moment, and if you'd have told me that we'd have been out of the EU 6 months ago, I'd have probably laughed.
Yeah, but that was a vote of the people. The customs union is quite clear on traded goods, and that's all it covers is traded goods. is that the whole point of being in the customs union is that the customs union does the free trade deals. So you can't have both. Do you understand that?
Yeah, no, as I've said, we would want to remain part of the customs union, and then we'll see what the government puts forward on that.
OK, we'll leave it there. Rebecca Long-Bailey, thank you for that.
Thanks very much.
Let's go over to Northern Ireland and our political editor there, Mark Devonport. Mark, what's been the reaction in Northern Ireland?
Well, I think initially a welcome to the increase that there's going to be in capital spending on infrastructure, because of course that trickles down to the regions like Northern Ireland. We are due over the next 4 years for, I think, a £250 million increase in capital spending on infrastructure, and so that will be welcomed by the construction industry locally and probably by most politicians. This has been an area where there's been a considerable amount of debate recently about whether we will miss out and not be able to build some much needed road schemes because of Brexit, because the local executive was applying for funding, or was planning to apply for funding from the European Union in relation to that. So I think over the next few weeks, and we're expecting our local budget here in the middle of December, we'll have a bit of a debate as to whether what the Chancellor has announced today plugs that gap.
That's the view from Belfast. Let's go back over to College Green. I'm joined now by Caroline Lucas from the Green Party and Jonathan Edwards from Plaid Cymru. Caroline Lucas, I'll come to you first. What's your overall reaction to the autumn statement?
Well, at a time when economically the country is moving into such uncharted waters with levels of insecurity higher than ever before, I was hoping that from this Chancellor we would have had more policies that would actually protected my constituents in Brighton much better than these will. So we're seeing instead a Chancellor who is committed still to give tax breaks to the richest, tax breaks to the corporations, and is taking away from the poorest in order to spend on that. And then when you add to that the fact that this is a Chancellor that didn't once mention the words climate change, this is in the year that's going to be on record as the hottest ever, a year when we know that we absolutely could be investing in home energy efficiency, creating jobs, getting emissions down, getting people's fuel bills down. There were some real win-wins here that could have been good for people, good for the environment, and again, he just blew it.
Jonathan Edwards, what's the Plaid Cymru view on this?
Well, I think it's the day that the mythical Tory long-term economic plan was shelved in favour of a more short-term economic scramble on the back of, very rapidly declining OBR forecasts over the 5 years, which is not just bad news, of course, for the public finances, but in terms of weakening job prospects and in terms of financial well-being, and especially when we look at some of the inflation forecasts, which is going to hit disposable income. And I think one of the big striking aspects of the statement that there was no indication from the Chancellor on what his position is going to be in terms of the single market and the customs union going forward.
An extra 400 million for the Welsh Government in this. Any ideas on how you'll spend it?
Well, that's 400 million over 5 years, of course. And when you compare that, about the same amount is going to be spent on renovating the Buckingham Palace, over £5 billion at least on the place behind me. I think it wasn't a very particularly serious fiscal intervention, because if you went back to the levels of infrastructure investment prior to the crash in 2008, that would be around 1% extra per annum of GDP. That would be 20 billion across the UK and £1 billion extra per annum for Wales. So I think the money that was announced, although welcome, isn't a particularly serious economic intervention.
Caroline Lucas, Philip Hammond confirmed that the starting rate for the 40% tax bracket would rise by 2020 to £50,000. John McDonnell for Labour has backed that. As I understand it, the Green Party's opposed to that. But a lot of people who would benefit from that, they're not rich, they're moderately affluent at most teachers, police officers, other public sector workers. Why would you be against them getting a fairer deal?
Well, I'm against it because it's essentially being paid for by some of the poorest people who are seeing, for example, the changes on universal credit that are not going to seriously help them. There's still going to be £3 billion worth of cuts to the work allowance of universal credit. So it's being paid for off the backs of some of the poorest people. That's why we're objecting to it. Essentially, this is a budget yet again for the more wealthy, in spite of the fact that only a few short months ago, Theresa May was standing on the doorstep of Downing Street promising us that this was going to be a budget and a country and a government that was going to be putting some of the poorest working class people at its heart. I think this budget demonstrates that that was simply a myth.
All right. Caroline Lucas and Jonathan Edwards, thank you very much for joining us there from College Green. I want to come to Kamal first, and because we should put what's happening here in a little bit of international context. It is clear that the government's fiscal position in this country is loosening, but we're not alone. The US budget deficit, their financial year ended on October the 1st. It's up 36% year on year. The French budget deficit is rising. The Commission has said to the Spanish and the Portuguese, we will not penalise you even though you are not sticking to the Maastricht rules. The Italian budget deficit is in some trouble and could be in a bit more trouble in a couple of weeks' time. So it seems, I would suggest that what Mr. Hammond has done, whether it was intentional or not, is he's moving with the flow where fiscal policy is once again taking centre stage.
I think that's right to an extent. I think that the issue will be for Philip Hammond is, do the markets believe, who invest in our debt, that the position he is outlining is sustainable? And at 90%, many economists judge that at 90% debt to GDP ratio, that sustainability issue is questionable.
So why are the Italians able to borrow at under 2%?
Yes, but they don't have the same financial city issues that we have. They have not spent the amounts of money that we had to do to rescue our banks. Governments generally are in a pretty benign situation at the moment. I think the big issue is that the interest being charged on all government's debt in the next 5 years is going to rise. We spend over £30 billion a year servicing our debt. That's why it matters. You asked Labour, why does it matter at balancing the books? I was surprised you didn't say, because you need to balance the books or bring a surplus in so you can bring your debts down, so you can spend less money servicing that debt and more money building hospitals and building schools. That's the reason I think the notion of fiscal discipline is an important one for this government. And if those interest rates start to rise as inflation risk starts rising and government risk premiums start rising, then those costs of servicing that debt go up and up and up. That adds to your borrowing, and that creates an economic problem for you as a government. I think that's why this is so central to the economic health of this country. And yes, you're right. In these benign times, fiscal policy can take more of the weight of the problem. But actually, the issue is that economies are not performing well enough to create wealth for people across all the income spectrum.
And the fact is, it is becoming more expensive for governments to borrow really across the Western world now. And the British government is finding that out, and now the American government as well. Let's go back to Joko in Portsmouth. Oh.
Yes, I'm here with the guys working in the racing catamaran here behind me at Land Rover BAR. They're putting the finishing touches to this boat, making it watertight and ready to hit the waters round Bermuda for the America's Cup next spring. But while they're busy working here down in Portsmouth, the Chancellor Philip Hammond says he's worried about productivity levels generally across the UK, that we're behind France, Germany and the US. So many British people are working longer hours for not very much pay. So he confirmed the announcement that the national living wage will go up from £7.20 to £7.50 an hour. Let's talk about that with Carrie Shea. She runs Le Café Parisien near the city centre of Portsmouth. That, of course, may be good news for some of your employees. How will it impact you?
Well, in the space of a year, it's gone up 80p, which is a lot considering that our profit has to outweigh that of the staff costs. We're employing anyone from 25 plus at 7.50. We're employing 21-year-olds to 25 at 6.95. One of two things will happen. That's our wage bill will just keep increasing, or we'll employ younger people.
Right. So somewhere you've got to make up the costs.
Exactly.
Are you going to put prices up to your customers?
No.
Right.
One thing I'm going to try my best not to do, even though we are currently paying 5% to 12% increase already on our imports.
Oh, right. So you've already experienced higher prices that you're having to pay?
Yes.
OK. How much did you say?
Up to 12%.
Up to 12%. And when did that start happening?
About 2 months ago.
Right, so already the higher prices are feeding through. There are warnings, of course, of higher inflation coming down the line. So how are you going to make the balancing act happen?
The balancing act is going to be a hard one. intend to always stock from local suppliers and just keep making sure that we're getting our best prices possible.
What are you most worried about going forward as a small business?
That we're not going to make it happen. That the government will keep pushing upon us the changes and not actually implying them. That they don't actually see what we're having to struggle with.
Right, so it's pretty tough now and you're worried it could get more difficult in the future. Well, of course, you're not the only business here in Portsmouth. To get a broader view of other businesses in the area and right across the county here on the south coast, let's speak to Stuart Dunn from Hampshire Chambers of Commerce. What did you make of Philip Hammond's statement today?
Well, I think on the broader context, it was a very sort of solid and reliable and much expected sort of statement. I think it's when you sort of delve down into the detail, and we've got to see a lot of that yet, is what it means for Hampshire and what it means for the south. Because whilst we welcome, obviously, infrastructure and digital infrastructure at that, there are some questions as to where some of that funding will be going.
How badly is it needed, the infrastructure here?
Well, the infrastructure in the south is creaking in terms of the rail network. The east-west connections between Portsmouth and Southampton are in desperate state of affairs. And actually, if that was improved, it would help bring traffic off the M27, which is also heaving as well.
Do you think there's been too much focus on the Northern Powerhouse? It was very much the centrepiece of George Osborne's statements and budgets. Philip Hammond wants to continue that, but do you think that has been at the expense of areas like Portsmouth and Hampshire?
Well, one got the feeling again that we were continuing down the Northern Powerhouse, and I welcome that for our friends in the north. Of course we do. But it can't be forgotten that the Southern Powerhouse is generating a lot of GVA for this country, and it needs to be supported and continue to be supported, which is why that infrastructure and digital particularly, we have businesses and business parks in Southampton and Portsmouth and Basingstoke which are reporting incredibly unacceptable slow speeds. That is not a way to boost productivity.
Now, he said, Philip Hammond, that he is going to inject money both into the digital infrastructure, into 5G mobile and into some of the rail networks and the road networks. What are the other major concerns for businesses in the Chambers of Commerce here?
Well, we'd like further clarity on the apprenticeship levy. Our members obviously are looking at that very closely and what it really means to them and how it will be implemented. Skills is a huge issue. Everyone is finding it difficult to recruit. We've got an ageing workforce. We need to ensure that the skills for the future are actually implemented and funded, and business needs support, education needs support.
What about skills of people here and also the skills that you are importing from abroad? Are there concerns about what will happen post-Brexit when we leave the EU in the sorts of people that you might be able to employ?
There are huge concerns about the EU nationals that are here, that are actually contributing and actually ensuring that actually we have a skilled workforce. You take them out of the equation, you put in the ageing workforce and record employment and record unemployment in terms of the numbers, and we've got a real cocktail of a problem.
Are you optimistic broadly about the future? When you look at the growth forecasts, they dip over the next couple of years, but then they pick up again towards 2020. But borrowing is obviously going to go up. Debt is going to peak around 2018. Are you optimistic then that the Chancellor can balance the books and at the same time allow businesses that you know to grow?
I think it was a very good plan to do what he's put in. It obviously reflects Brexit and the short-term problems that we're going to have, but also reflects the longer-term opportunities that we're seeking to actually take. And I think we could have done more for exporters, first-time exporters, to actually give incentives. Yes, there was the doubling of the allowance on finance, but I think we could have done more to actually open up new markets and help the Department of International Trade and the overseas chambers to actually get out there and open up new markets of innovation, science and technology, where we can actually export these services, these goods, out to other markets.
Right, and of course that can only be done to some extent, the free trade deals, once we've left the EU. So do you think those businesses are ready to wait for a period of time until it becomes clearer as to what the government's plan will be?
I think we can get out there and export to all our other areas that we have deals with outside of Europe, and we need to get there.
All right, Stuart Dunn, thank you very much. And that's it from us here down at Land Rover BAR in Portsmouth. And with that, it's back to you, Andrew, in the studio.
Thanks, Joko. Well, we're just about coming to the end of our coverage. A few minutes yet here on BBC Two. So let's take you through the headlines of Chancellor Hammond's autumn statement. So, economic forecast first. Government debt will peak at just over 90% of GDP in the next financial year, a lot more than was thought in the March budget. There'll be £122 of additional borrowing over the next 5 years. No sign then of being able to get to budget surplus. It won't be reached by 2020. Indeed, there is now no date as to when it will be reached. And the government saying, the OBR saying that growth over 2% this year, but it expects it to fall to 1.4% next year. Quite a lot hangs on that particular forecast. On household budgets, the national living wage to rise to £7.50 an hour in April. We knew that. Fuel duty rise cancelled. That tends to happen in budgets and autumn statements these days. Universal credit taper rate reduced from 65 to 63 pence for every pound earned is a cut, but not a lot. And upfront letting agency fees are banned in England as they are already in Scotland. Other measures: insurance premium tax to increase from 10 to 12% next June. Northern Ireland to receive extra money, Wales extra money, Scotland extra money as well. Another £1.4 billion to help build affordable homes. There aren't many being built in England at the moment. And another £1.3 billion to improve transport networks. Laura, a thought from you.
I think there are two big thoughts, if I may, from today. First of all, the Chancellor has given himself more flexibility. He's going to borrow more, a lot more than we expected just a few months ago. He's looking at an extremely different economic picture. But for the Tory government, who's been in charge since 2010, they are now looking to basically get through a whole decade, 10 years, without having been able to complete their central mission, that promise in 2010 to balance the books. That may be down to events rather than their own decisions, but that in and of itself is quite an extraordinary fact. Second of all, for Theresa May, with her ambition to help people who are having a hard time trying to make ends meet, there was really very little in today's statement that adds up to a coherent message, some kind of big thing that will really filter through, that people will feel as a benefit in their pockets. And neither of those things, really, the Chancellor having to deal with a much harder picture and not coming up with measures that might tickle the tummies of Middle England, neither of those are credits for the government. Not the most dramatic day, but big implications from both of those things.
And I shall try not to sputter through your final thought on this, Kamal.
I mean, really echoing Laura, I mean, two words that are never that comfortable in the mouth of a Conservative Chancellor: borrowing up, debt up. Four words, sorry, that are not all that comfortable. I mean, there are some not very sexy areas that are vitally important: productivity, house building. Philip Hammond has at least given a nod to that, but chancellors over the ages have tried to fix, frankly, the economic performance of Britain not being strong enough to allow people to increase their wages and to bring wealth to more of those just managing families. But the big picture is 2008 and the financial crisis, we are still paying today.
It's lingering, hasn't it?
More than anyone expected. More than anyone expected in 2008, we are still paying the price for that. And the government has made promise after promise after promise that it has not been, that the government has not been able to fix. Debt to GDP ratio of 90% is of great concern, particularly when government borrowing costs will increase over the next 5 years.
I thank you both. We'll leave it there. That's it for our coverage of the autumn statement. On the day, we discovered that the official forecast doesn't think that we're heading for a recession. The growth will continue, but not as strong as they thought. And so the government is going to borrow a lot more. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.